Robb Stark stood on the ramparts of Riverrun, the Tully banners fluttering below in the courtyard, and let the chill wind tug at his cloak as he looked out over the river. He had come here burdened by heartbreak and war, weighed down by his father's death, and the indignities cast upon House Stark by the Iron Throne. His heart was a wounded beast, yet there was in him a flicker of possibility that he had not felt before. He had called the banners to avenge Eddard Stark, the noblest man he had ever known, and to secure independence for the North. But things were changing in ways no one had foreseen. New tidings had reached him from across the narrow sea. Daenerys Targaryen was not the girl he had once dismissed in rumor, a wandering beggar queen. She was a liberator, a queen with dragons. And with her dragons, she possessed a power to rival the greatest houses of Westeros. There were voices in his council, most of them lords of the North, others from the Riverlands, who clamored for total war against House Lannister. They wanted to push the advantage, to exploit every moment of the Lion's weakness. Tywin Lannister might have cunning in droves, but Robb had proven himself cunning on the battlefield in his own right. He had outmaneuvered Jaime Lannister, capturing him and striking fear into their enemies. Yet he knew that cunning alone was not enough to save the North or to unify the realm behind a stable future. Word of Renly Baratheon's colorful armies had trickled in as well, and then the tidings of his death. Stannis Baratheon's forces lurked, threatening to become a major player if they secured the Iron Throne. Balon Greyjoy had declared himself king of the Isles and the North, launching Ironborn raids along the coasts and in the North itself. Chaos stretched across Westeros like a chain of tinder-dry fields waiting for a spark. In the dark corners of his mind, Robb recalled his father's unwavering sense of honor, a code that demanded more than mere vengeance. Ned Stark had abhorred betrayal, lying, and cruelty. He had followed Robert Baratheon to victory during the rebellion not because Robert was perfect, but because Ned trusted that Robert's reign, founded on the idea of unifying the Seven Kingdoms, would herald peace or at the very least hold the realm together. That legacy, frayed and battered though it might be, lingered in Robb's heart. Standing on the walls of Riverrun, Robb pictured the father he had lost. He felt that presence guiding him now, as strongly as a father's hand upon his shoulder. It was Ned's voice, urging him to remember the bigger picture, to protect the realm as well as avenge House Stark. He could not undo what had been done. Ned's head was gone from his body, paraded cruelly before the Red Keep. But maybe the realm could be saved, strengthened, guarded against the rapacious cruelty of those who would tear it apart for power's sake. If Robert Baratheon's dream was unity, perhaps there was one more chance to realize it. Through the last Targaryen, so they said, who grew stronger day by day in the Far East, he heard soft footfalls behind him. Grey Wind, his dire wolf, lifted his head from where he lounged. Robb turned and found Caitlin Stark approaching, her hair escaping its bindings in the wind, a sorrowful smile upon her lips. "My son," she said, voice subdued, "are you thinking of him again?" "I always am," Robb replied, a raw edge in his voice. He hesitated, then pressed on. "Mother, there's word from Essos. Daenerys Targaryen raises an army. I've heard she has dragons, real ones. I didn't believe it at first, but these rumors keep growing and men keep talking. And what do you intend to do with such tidings?" Robb looked away, eyes scanning the broad water below. "I could do nothing," he admitted quietly. "We could carry on our fight alone, keep pressing the Lannisters in the Riverlands and hold the North. Yet I can't stop thinking about this path my father once nearly walked. He was no friend to the Targaryens, yet he remembered that not all Targaryens were the same. He believed in justice, not in mindless bloodshed." Caitlin nodded. "Some might call an alliance with a Targaryen folly. And yet, if she truly commands dragons..." "That's just it," Robb said. "Her father was the Mad King, but she is not her father, so the whispers go. She broke chains in Slavers Bay. People call her Breaker of Chains and Mother of Dragons. She's forging some new destiny. And we might have a common cause in the end, dethroning the Lannisters, ensuring the realm does not collapse into ruin." Caitlin's face contorted with a mother's worry. "You would negotiate? You must tread carefully. You'd risk your men, your cause, your titles for a bond with a Targaryen you do not know." Robb exhaled. "I risk everything by continuing the war without end. Our men bleed every day, the Riverlands burn. Winterfell has been taken by the Ironborn. War devours all. My father taught me that the right course is often the hardest." If Daenerys Targaryen truly is the rightful queen and if she might be an ally to the north. He paused. The wind whipped around them, rustling the Stark banners overhead. This is something bigger than the north alone, he said. Maybe it's the best way to keep my father's values alive. Robert Baratheon once sought to unify the realm. He hammered it together on the anvil of rebellion, but the forging was incomplete. The cracks are everywhere. If I can help achieve a real unity this time, maybe that's the path. But if she is the tyrant her father was, then we have no recourse but to stand against her. I must learn who she truly is. I must negotiate. Cailin placed a hand on his shoulder, searching his face. Then we need an envoy. Someone of honor, someone we trust, to carry your message. That is where I must begin. In the cold hush that followed, both mother and son knew they stood upon the precipice of a decision that could alter the fate of the North, perhaps the entire realm. The lines of war were thickly drawn, but there might be room yet for a new alliance. If the North was to survive, it would need more than isolation, it would need cunning, it would need trust, and it would need a partner with fire and blood on her side. By dawn the next day, in the great hall of Riverrun, a small group had assembled at Robb's request. The air was thick with tension. There were only a few who even knew of the matter at hand. The Blackfish, Brynden Tully, was among them, his weathered face set in a stoic mask. Edmure Tully listened apprehensively, his brow creased. The Greyjoy's booming voice was uncharacteristically hushed, while Roose Bolton stood off to one side, silently observing with those pale eyes that gave nothing away. I have decided, Robb said, addressing the assembly, to send an envoy to the east. Word is Daenerys Targaryen grows in power by the day. Her dragons will soon be of an age to take the skies. If that is true, and if she truly marches west someday, we must be ready. I would sooner bend an ear in good faith now than scramble at the last moment. This war has ravaged us, our cause remains just, but we cannot fight every enemy on every front. We need an ally. Murmurs rippled across the group. The Greyjoy scratched his beard. So we'd kneel to another Targaryen after all these years? Didn't Robert Baratheon smash that house down with his hammer? Robb stiffened at the mention of Robert, but then forced himself calm. I don't propose bending the knee. I propose learning who Daenerys Targaryen is, what she wants, and whether there is a path forward. Our enmity is with the Lannisters, not necessarily with Targaryens. Robert's rebellion was based on more than a dispute with the crown. We followed him because Aerys was mad, not because we despised all Targaryens. It seems that this one, if reports are true, has done acts of mercy and justice in the East, freeing slaves and punishing tyrants. We should see for ourselves. Bolton's voice slid into the conversation like a cold blade. And if the rumors are false? If she is but another tyrant? Then we learn that before she ever sails west, Robb replied. We can prepare. This is our chance to gather knowledge, not to throw ourselves at the feet of a stranger. He surveyed the men around him, men who had named him king in the north, men who had hailed him as the young wolf. He saw a mixture of excitement and fear in their eyes. The times were changing. No one would have guessed only a year ago that the last Targaryen might rise to challenge the Lannisters and the Baratheons. And who will be your envoy? The Blackfish asked. You can't go yourself, obviously. Ser Robin Ryger is a loyal man of Riverrun. He will sail with a small retinue east, Robb said. I want them to find Daenerys Targaryen. If that is truly who she is and present our intention for a diplomatic conversation, we could offer terms, explore alliances, or simply open a line of correspondence. All I ask is that we approach this carefully. No one beyond these walls can know of this mission. The Blackfish nodded in approval. Ser Robin is dependable. He'll keep his wits about him. Cailin, from her seat at her son's side, had watched the conversation unfold with regal composure, though anxiety flickered behind her eyes. Ser Robin is loyal, but we need to ensure he does not go alone. Perhaps it might help to have others with him, men with an understanding of Essos, or at least men of broader experience. I know a few knights who traveled in their youth. I'll see to it, Robb said. Then he breathed a sigh, as though having decided a most weighty matter. If we do nothing, and Daenerys Targaryen lands someday on the shores of Westeros with a host of Unsullied and 3 dragons at her command, what then? We would be caught between Lannisters, Ironborn, Baratheons, and a Dragon Queen. This is our chance to shape the future, or at least learn if we have a future under this queen. My father would not have closed his eyes to the possibility of forging a more just realm. He might not have trusted easily, but he would have listened and weighed the worth of a person, not just their name. The council ended with guarded agreement. They would dispatch an envoy and see what might come of it. That very day, ravens flew to a handful of loyal lords, calling them to secrecy and instructing them to send certain men to Riverrun. Quietly, preparations began for the long voyage. The Great John boasted that no Targaryen could frighten him, but he kept his voice low. The men parted ways with a shared sense of stepping onto uncertain ground. Far across the sea, Daenerys Targaryen walked the ramparts of Meereen. The city was mostly at peace, though it still bore scars of her conquest. Below, in the plaza outside the Grand Pyramid, freedmen sold their wares and moved through the streets in pursuit of new livelihoods. The great harpy statue no longer loomed overhead. She had taken it down when she'd conquered the city. She felt a cautious hope whenever she beheld the changed streets. Yet the burden of rule pressed down upon her shoulders. Ruling was far more complicated than conquest. She had learned that bitterly. She touched the scaled head of Drogon, who had landed on a stone ledge nearby, the largest and fiercest of her children. She had come so far from the frightened girl who wandered the red wastes, from the timid princess sold in marriage to Khal Drogo. Now she was a queen who had freed thousands from chains, yet she could not ignore the call of Westeros. She was of House Targaryen, the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. Still, she had not yet set sail. Her advisors remained divided as to the best moment for the crossing. Some, like Daario Naharis, pressed her to leave these fractious lands behind and cross the sea swiftly. Others, like Ser Barristan Selmy, counseled patience, urging her to shore up her rule here, gather resources, and strengthen her forces. She had heard rumors of the war that raged in Westeros. She knew the Lannisters still gripped the throne. She knew there were pretenders and kings in the north, in the Isles. She knew the Starks had endured grievous losses, that King Robb Stark was rumored to be cunning in battle but struggling to hold his own. Her thoughts often flickered to the memory of her family's downfall. Robert Baratheon had led the rebellion that ended her father's reign. Many in Westeros despised the Targaryen name, or so she had been told. But she found comfort in the idea that not all houses had been so zealously hateful. The Starks, by some accounts, had not been bloodthirsty. Eddard Stark, it was said, had been an honorable man. It was a curious thought that House Stark might someday be an ally rather than an enemy. That evening, as dusk fell upon Meereen, Daenerys retreated to her private audience chamber. Ser Barristan arrived, bowing stiffly. Daario Naharis followed, a swagger in his step. Missandei stood ready to interpret for those who might not speak the common tongue well, though in this instance it was unnecessary. Barristan was fluent, as was Daario. But she liked Missandei's presence, the girl's calm intellect and unwavering loyalty. "There is a matter that requires your attention, your grace," Ser Barristan said, voice laced with curiosity. "We have in custody some sailors who claimed they come from Westeros. They arrived in a trading cog by way of Pentos, so they say, and they asked to see you directly." Dany's eyebrow arched. "From Westeros? Traders? Seeking to profit from me? Or something else?" Daario's grin flashed. "Perhaps spiced wine, or sweet words from half a world away. Let us see them, and then be rid of them if they prove worthless." She eyed him. Daario's flamboyant impatience sometimes grated, but he was useful enough. "Very well. Bring them in." Missandei slipped out to summon the visitors. Dany set herself on the modest throne she used in Meereen, a chair of carved wood rather than the monstrous seat the city's masters had once perched upon. Her silver-gold hair fell loose about her shoulders. Drogon was not in the chamber. She rarely allowed the dragons near strangers these days, having learned that their presence could spook visitors or cause violence. But Regal and Viserion stirred restlessly in a nearby enclosure, occasionally letting out a distant roar that rumbled through the walls. The visitors entered. Ser Robin Ryger bowed deeply, his cloak dusty from travel. 3 others bowed behind him. A knight of House Mallister, a man bearing no sigil on his simple tunic, and another from the Riverlands. Daenerys regarded them all with quiet curiosity. The man who stepped forward was older, his shoulders broad, his face tanned by sea and sun. "Your Grace," he began, "I am Ser Robin Ryger of Riverrun. I come in the name of King Robb Stark of the North." Daario stiffened. Barristan's eyes flickered. Daenerys herself felt her heart pick up a beat. "King Robb Stark," she repeated carefully, her voice measured. "So it is true he remains in the field. The war continues in Westeros." "He does, Your Grace, and with all respect, we come not as spies but as emissaries. He sends his greetings and this letter." Ser Robin extended a small scroll sealed with a direwolf sigil. Dany accepted it, glancing once at Barristan. Then she broke the seal with an elegant motion of her fingers. The letter was brief, but it was couched in careful courtesy. It introduced Robb Stark by his titles, King in the North and in the Trident, and it named Daenerys as a rightful heir of House Targaryen, Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, words that made her spine tingle with recognition. He wrote of a desire for open discussion, for potential alliance, for an end to Lannister tyranny and a forging of a new unity. It was couched in diplomatic language, and nowhere did it explicitly mention the historical bloodshed between their houses. It read as though it was written by someone who weighed each word with care. When she finished reading, she folded the parchment. "You have come far," she said to Ser Robin, "and you have risked much. What is it that your king truly wants?" He lifted his head, a level sincerity in his eyes. "To end the war, your grace. He fights in the Riverlands. He fights for justice, for the memory of his father, Lord Eddard Stark, who was slain by the Lannisters. He does not seek to see the realm torn apart. The Lannisters cling to power at the cost of many lives. King Robb believes, as his father did, that honor and justice might yet guide the realm. We have heard tales of your justice in Slaver's Bay, how you freed the oppressed. That speaks to us of your character. We come to learn more and to see if you might be an ally." Daenerys listened, mind racing. Could this be real? She turned her gaze to Ser Barristan. The old knight had once served House Stark's ally, Robert Baratheon, but he had also served under her father for a time. She thought she saw a glimmer of approval in his eyes, approval that the North might be reaching out a hand. Barristan spoke gently, "Your Grace, Robb Stark is said to be young, but he has proven himself honorable in many ways. He released his enemies after capturing them in battle. He has not allied himself with the Lannisters or the Greyjoys. House Stark had no love for the Mad King, but nor did Eddard Stark take pleasure in the butchery of Targaryens. There is a certain logic to this approach." Daario made a dismissive motion. "Words and logic. Let them bow if they want your alliance." Daenerys shot him a reproving look. "They have not come to treat me like a petty warlord. They offer courtesy. I will return it." She turned again to Ser Robin. "King Robb Stark's letter speaks of forging a new unity. Does he claim the entirety of Westeros for himself? Or does he accept another? He was crowned king in the North by his lords, your grace. He claims the North and also the Riverlands by right of the injustice done to his house. As to the Iron Throne, he does not seek it. His father never sought such lofty ambitions. But the war has forced him into a position where he must be king to defend his people. Yet if your claim is just, if you show yourself worthy, there may be terms for the realm's unity under the Targaryen banner once again, provided you grant the North its proper liberties or come to some arrangement. I can speak no further without my king's counsel, but know that he is open to a realm not riven by warlords and tyrants." Daenerys felt a quiet stirring of something, hope or perhaps caution. She thought of her father, the Mad King, whose cruelty had brought about the ruin of House Targaryen. Now here stood an envoy from the family of one of the men who had rebelled, albeit a smaller role than Robert or Tywin Lannister. And he offered a potential alliance in place of yet more bloodshed. Her mind spun with the possibilities. If the North stood with her when the time came to cross, that would be a powerful statement. But she must not leap blindly into trust. She folded her hands in her lap. "Ser Robin, I will consider your words and King Robb Stark's letter. You shall stay here in Meereen as my guests. We will speak again soon." Days turned into weeks in Meereen as Daenerys entertained formal and informal talks with Ser Robin and his retinue. She invited them to feast with her courtiers, listened to their accounts of the war in Westeros, and asked question after question. She learned how the Lannisters had orchestrated the downfall of Eddard Stark, how King Joffrey had beheaded him, sparking the North's rebellion. She heard of Robb Stark's victories, of the betrayal by some of his bannermen, of the Ironborn assaults on the North. Each tale painted a broader picture. The realm was fracturing, and many common folk suffered. At the same time, Ser Robin and his knights gleaned their own insights about Daenerys. They saw the city she ruled, the attempts at governance, the challenges she faced with the Sons of the Harpy, the ex-slave population, and the complexities of Meereen's traditions. They witnessed how she treated criminals with firmness but not with wanton cruelty. They saw the dragons, living, breathing monsters of fire, now the size of large horses. That alone was enough to make their hearts pound. But they saw in Daenerys no sign of a maniac lusting to burn the world. In the evenings, Daenerys would consult privately with Ser Barristan, Missandei, and Daario. Barristan, in his cautious, fatherly tone, reminded her to see the potential of this alliance and to weigh the North's sincerity. Daario, with his swagger, would warn her that trusting any Westerosi was dangerous. But she sensed even Daario recognized the advantage. The Starks were not the Lannisters, they did not historically revel in Targaryen blood. If she had to choose a potential ally in Westeros, House Stark might be the surest bet. Eventually, after carefully drafting her own letter in response, one in which she expressed interest in a peaceful alliance and requested certain assurances, Daenerys sealed it with her personal sigil. She handed the letter to Ser Robin in a quiet courtyard within the Great Pyramid. He bowed as she gave it. "Your king shall read this," she said. "It is an invitation to further discussion, perhaps in person if the situation permits. I make no promises of bending or of ignoring the history between our houses. But I do see a chance to shape a new era for the Seven Kingdoms, one in which cruelty does not thrive. If King Robb Stark truly holds his father's honor in his heart, and if he believes as I do that the Lannisters must be toppled for the good of the realm, then we have a common cause." Ser Robin accepted the letter as though it were a precious stone. "Then we shall return with haste, your grace. I thank you for your hospitality." She dipped her head. "May the winds favor your sails." In the north, winter's breath had begun to stir. Robb received Daenerys' letter not in Riverrun, but at the Twins, where he had traveled for a short and tense meeting with Walder Frey. The old man's cunning eyes flickered greedily as Robb moved through the castle, but Robb largely ignored Frey's barbs. Robb's heart was pounding. He carried within his breast the knowledge that Ser Robin Ryger's ship had arrived at Seaguard, bringing a sealed letter from the Dragon Queen. In a private solar at the Twins, Robb sat with his mother, the Blackfish, and a handful of trusted lords. He carefully broke the wax seal featuring the three-headed dragon. The parchment was neatly rolled. As he read, a hush fell over the room. Daenerys Targaryen wrote in a voice that seemed strong and poised. She thanked him for sending envoys, acknowledged his father's honorable reputation, and reiterated that she possessed a rightful claim to the throne of Westeros. She wrote that she would consider an alliance if Robb truly sought the well-being of the realm. She was willing to negotiate terms that would respect the North's traditions. She stated plainly that she had no interest in punishing the innocent for Robert Baratheon's rebellion so long as House Stark would not stand in her way. She offered to meet him in a place and manner they both deemed safe, or to continue exchanging letters until they found a more opportune time. Robb set the letter down. Emotion warred inside him. He could all but hear the ghosts of the past. His father had marched with Robert Baratheon to overthrow the Targaryens, but that was because of Aerys' madness, the kidnapping of Lyanna, and the realm's outrage at the brutality visited upon the Starks and their allies. Yet here was Daenerys, speaking of justice, of forging a new future free of Lannister corruption. She even addressed him as king in the north, showing a willingness to accept his title. She had not demanded an immediate bending of the knee. "It seems genuine," Cailin said softly. "She does not speak like her father." The Blackfish nodded, though he did not look entirely convinced. "Words are wind, as some say. Yet if she is sincere, she could be a powerful ally indeed." "So we continue," Robb said firmly. "We answer her in kind. We propose further talks." He paused, glancing at the men assembled, the Blackfish, Roose Bolton, a few others. "Should we risk a personal meeting?" Roose Bolton's eyes were as pale as winter skies. "Sailing across the sea in the midst of war, or inviting a dragon queen to Westeros is a dangerous game, your grace. You cannot be seen as a supplicant, nor should you trust that she wouldn't take you hostage if you ventured to her territory. Though I suspect you will find a safer path than placing your neck under her blade." "A mutual place," Robb said, "perhaps on neutral ground or at sea. But we are not at that point yet. For now, we will reply in writing. Then we might send a more permanent embassy to remain with her. Or invite one of hers here. We must tread carefully." Quietly, he read the letter again. The mention of dragons both thrilled and unnerved him. 3 dragons, grown bigger by the day. Could they truly be the key to toppling the Lannisters? Or would they become a new terror for Westeros, turning its fields to ash? He remembered the cold wind on the battlements, the memory of his father's unwavering gaze. A Targaryen alliance might be the realm's salvation or its doom. But if they did nothing, doom seemed all but certain anyway. He rose from his seat. "I shall draft my reply at once." As the war in Westeros trudged on, ravens flew back and forth across the narrow sea. Missives crossed between King Robb Stark and Queen Daenerys Targaryen, carefully penned and sealed. Each letter sought to gauge the other's intentions, to clarify points of contention, to propose potential terms. Whispers of the negotiations began to swirl among the bannermen, though most did not know the details. A sense of disquiet and curiosity pervaded the Riverlands. Some men bristled at the notion of dealings with a Targaryen. Others were cautiously optimistic, believing the dragons might burn the Lannisters to cinders. Rumors circulated that Robb might marry Daenerys to secure the alliance, though nothing of the sort had actually been proposed. Meanwhile, Caitlin Stark worked behind the scenes to ensure that each letter was couched in respect and caution. She urged her son to reflect the best of Ned Stark in his tone. Your father always believed that loyalty, once given, should be honored. He also believed that trust must be earned, she reminded him. Daenerys Targaryen rights of freeing slaves. That is no small thing. Perhaps she truly does share some part of our values. Robb nodded. If she is half the woman these letters suggest, then we might be forging something new. But if she is only another tyrant, she will show her true face eventually. The negotiations were not the only matters demanding Robb's attention. He fought battles against the Lannisters, shifting troops along the Red Fork to keep Tywin's men at bay. He received urgent ravens from the north, telling of atrocities committed by the Ironborn. He pressed Roose Bolton to retake Winterfell, though the man was cryptic and slow. The realm continued in chaos, but the letters from Essos gave Robb a strange sense of direction, as though he were navigating by a star that might bring him out of the darkness. Then, in the midst of these swirling events, came a fateful letter from Daenerys Targaryen. She proposed a secret meeting on the Isle of Lys to occur in a few months' time. She had connections in Lys, she wrote. It was a neutral city-state, wealthy and known for its trade, and it had fewer loyalties to either Westeros or Slavers Bay. If Robb would come with a small retinue under truce, no more than a dozen men, she would arrive likewise, bringing only a handful of her most trusted advisors. There, they might speak face-to-face, outside the glare of armies and suspicious courts. Robb's advisors erupted in debate over whether he should go. Some insisted it was a trap, others believed it was an unprecedented opportunity. But Robb felt the stirring of certainty in his gut, that same spark he had felt standing on Riverrun's ramparts. The same voice that reminded him of Ned Stark's unwavering sense of justice, of Robert Baratheon's flawed but sincere desire to unify the realm. He made up his mind. I will go. Despite the protests, he maintained his resolve. If I do not show trust, how can I expect her to trust me? We will set conditions for the meeting. We will choose a lysine bank that is neutral, a building neither side controls. We'll ensure there is no possibility of an ambush. Ser Brynden Tully will accompany me, along with some loyal men. We will not go unprotected, but we will not appear as conquerors either. Caitlyn's eyes were bright with concern. I cannot lose you as well, she said, voice trembling. If you go, you must come back, Robb. He embraced her. I will. For father's honor, for the North, for the chance to end this war, I will go. And so the course was set. A raven carried Robb's acceptance, and plans were made for a carefully timed voyage that would take him from the north down to White Harbor, then across the narrow sea in secrecy. The rest of Westeros might not even know of his absence until it was done. If all went well, he would return with the seeds of an alliance that could reshape the realm. On a crisp morning some weeks later, Daenerys Targaryen found herself in a palatial villa just outside the city proper of Lys. The city was known for its courtesans and perfumes, for its ocean breezes and soft summer rains. The call of exotic birds drifted from the courtyard gardens, and the faint scent of salt and roses lingered in the air. She wore a gown of simple, pale fabric, not her usual queenly attire, but comfortable and elegant enough. At her side were Ser Barristan and Missandei. Daario had wanted to come, but Daenerys decided to bring him as part of an outer guard, not directly into the meeting. She knew Daario's presence could provoke tension. She wanted a smaller, calmer circle. They had chosen a bright, open room in the villa for the encounter. Sunlight streamed in through arched windows, illuminating marble floors. She had arrived first, flanked by two Unsullied who stood guard at the doorway. She felt a coil of tension in her stomach. Years of longing to return to Westeros, and here she was, about to meet face to face with the king in the north, son of the man whose friend had toppled her father's throne. A swirl of emotions passed through her. Excitement, anxiety, determination. The memory of her father's madness lurked in the background, but she reminded herself she was not the same as Aerys. At last, footsteps and murmurs in the corridor signaled Robb Stark's approach. He entered with half a dozen men, among them an older knight with a gruff look, who had to be Brynden Blackfish Tully. Another was a tall man wearing the direwolf sigil. Robb Stark himself was younger than she'd expected, only a handful of years older than she was, with auburn hair that curled slightly, and a stern set to his mouth. But he moved with the assured step of a man who had led armies, who had lost much, who had already shouldered a crown's heavy weight. He hesitated at the threshold, his gray eyes sweeping across the room until they settled on her. She saw a flicker of surprise, or perhaps curiosity, in his gaze, as though he, too, had expected someone older or stranger. He bowed slightly, not as a subject, but as one monarch greeting another. She inclined her head in turn. "Queen Daenerys Targaryen," Robb said, his voice firm. "I am Robb Stark, King in the North. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting." She gestured to a wooden table in the center of the room, set with chairs enough for them and their companions. A pitcher of cool water stood ready. "Please sit. We have much to discuss." They took their seats. Daenerys sat with Ser Barristan to her right, Missandei to her left. Robb sat across from her, with the Blackfish at his side, and a stalwart young knight on his other side. Both groups eyed each other warily, but not with outright hostility. Outside, the Unsullied and Northmen maintained watch, ensuring no unwelcome visitors would interrupt. Daenerys spoke first. "Your letters were most intriguing, King Robb. You say you do not seek the Iron Throne for yourself, only justice for the wrongs done to your house. You say you wish for the North to remain free of Southern oppression. I can understand that, yet you have called your banners to war. What is it you ultimately hope to achieve in this alliance?" Robb's gaze did not waver. "I want the downfall of the Lannisters, who murdered my father under the guise of the Crown's authority. I want a realm that is not subject to the whims of a mad boy king or the cruelty of Queen Cersei. The North has declared its independence. My lords named me king, for they do not trust that any southern throne would respect the North's sovereignty. But if I found a ruler in the South who would allow the North its traditional autonomy, I would not be so quick to cling to a crown. Even now, the North bleeds. This war has worn us down. My father believed in protecting the people. I believe in protecting the people, too." She considered his words. "And do you believe I could be that ruler in the South? I have been called many things, breaker of chains, mother of dragons. You must also know I am the daughter of Ares, who some called the Mad King." Robb nodded gravely. "I have heard. Your father committed many crimes, including the murder of my grandfather and uncle. But I also know that you freed slaves in Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen. I know that you enacted justice where you found cruelty. You have not come to Westeros, or so it seems, to burn cities for the sake of vengeance. I only know what I've heard and read. Meeting you in person is a chance for me to see the truth in your eyes." Daenerys felt her heartbeat quicken. "And what do you see?" He met her gaze. "I see a woman who wears her birthright as both a crown and a burden. I see caution, I see strength, and I see the potential for compassion." She allowed herself a small, wry smile. "I am no tyrant, Robb Stark. I do not wish to set the world aflame. I wish to claim what is mine, the Iron Throne, and shape a better future for the people of Westeros. I did not come all this way to become my father, to earn the hatred of the realm. The real question is whether you can accept a Targaryen on the throne, given the North's history." The Blackfish cleared his throat. "The North accepted Targaryens before, at least after Aegon's conquest, until your father burned our kin. And your brother Rhaegar took Lyanna Stark." He faltered. Robb laid a hand gently on the Blackfish's arm, a subtle gesture to keep him from diving into deeper grudges. "We cannot forget the past," Robb said quietly, "but we need not be slaves to it either. My father taught me that we should judge each person on their own merits. If you prove yourself worthy, Daenerys Targaryen, if you keep your word and bring justice to the realm, the North could accept you as queen, with conditions that respect our sovereignty and traditions. Our men will fight beside yours to depose the Lannisters, and if you wish it, we will stand with you against any other threats." Daenerys's mind flashed to the cunning faces of the Lannisters, to the rumors of Tywin's brutal campaigns, to the boy King Joffrey's monstrous deeds. Then she imagined the North's fierce warriors, dire wolves in their banners, battling for her cause. She thought of her dragons soaring over the battlefield. She felt a pulse of possibility. "And in return," she said, "you would want me to recognize the North's independence?" Robb hesitated. That was my first desire when I was crowned. But the realm is in chaos. A part of me wonders if we are stronger together than apart. It was Robert Baratheon's dream to unify the realm, though the reality of his rule did not live up to that dream. Perhaps, though, if the right person sat the throne, the North might consent to rejoin the realm. Under certain guarantees. Less interference from southern lords, the right to choose our own wardens and governors, a measure of self-rule. I'd have to consult my lords, but I might be able to persuade them. My father was not a man who sought to tear the realm asunder. He followed Robert because of the atrocities of Aerys and the personal outrage against our house. But times have changed. We must think of the future of stability. She studied him, nodding slowly. Ser Barristan watched her, a slight smile on his face. Perhaps he remembered Eddard Stark as an honorable young man in King's Landing, the friend of Robert. Now here was Ned's son, forging a new path. I would be amenable to that discussion, Daenerys said, her tone measured. But we should be clear. I must sit the Iron Throne, not as a puppet but as queen. If you or any northern lords conspire against me, you will face the wrath of the crown and my dragons. I say that not as a threat but as a simple truth. The realm needs order. If I must burn out rebellion, I will. But I will not do so lightly, and I will not do so if it is unnecessary. Robb did not flinch at her mention of dragons. He gave a single, resolute nod. I understand. You have that right if indeed you wear the crown, but I will not betray you if you prove just. Their words hung in the air, a delicate balance between promise and threat, trust and caution. Gradually, as the sun arced overhead, they delved into more specifics. They spoke of strategy. How might the North's armies coordinate with Daenerys' forces? When would she sail for Westeros? She admitted that she would not leave Slaver's Bay without ensuring stability there. Robb described the precarious alliances he held in the Riverlands and North. They spoke also of the rumored other claimants, Stannis Baratheon, rumored to be forging alliances in the south. They did not yet touch upon marriage or binding ties, though the possibility hovered at the edges of the conversation. By the time the sun was low, a measure of rapport had formed between them. Though they remained cautious, they recognized in each other a shared desire to carve out a realm not defined by the cruelty that had undone so many. They agreed to further steps, a more permanent exchange of envoys, a schedule of communication, a plan that would see the North and the Targaryen forces coordinate once Daenerys was ready to sail. There were countless details yet to settle: ships, timing, logistics, the stance of other houses, whether House Stark could unify the Riverlands in support. But the seed of alliance was planted and it felt real. When the meeting drew to a close, Daenerys rose, extending a hand toward Robb. He stood as well, placing his hand in hers. The moment felt symbolic, a bridging of centuries of enmity. He was tall, and she felt the faint warmth of his calloused palm. In a quiet voice, she said, I do not want to see your people suffer another day under the Lannisters. If we stand together, perhaps we can end their reign. And if we are to truly unify the realm, we must do it with justice in our hearts. He nodded, his voice equally low. My father would approve, I think. He believed in justice, too. Let us do this. Let us put an end to the bloodshed and stand against the real enemies. They released hands, a spark of UND. Or standing passing between them. Neither knew how the future would unfold, but there was, in that moment, a sense of genuine possibility. The ghosts of the past were not banished, but they did not strangle the moment either. Targaryen and Stark, together, a strange alliance in a time of endless war, perhaps exactly what the realm needed. Under the shimmering sky of Lys, with the salt breeze drifting through the villa's arches, both parties carefully withdrew to their respective ships and accommodations. Robb escorted his retinue back to the vessel that would carry them north. Daenerys lingered in the courtyard a moment, watching him depart. She saw him turn once, meeting her gaze across the distance. She lifted a hand in a silent farewell, and he inclined his head. Then he was gone. That night, Daenerys stayed awake for a long time, pacing the mosaic floors of her bedchamber. Missandei dozed off in a chair, and Daario was out with the men, ensuring the city was quiet. Ser Barristan had retired, trusting in her judgment. She was alone with her thoughts. She pictured Robb Stark's resolute face, his unwavering honesty. She thought of her dragons, caged so long in Meereen, longing to soar free over Westeros. She thought of the Iron Throne, the thousands of swords hammered into that cruel seat. She thought of the North, stark and cold, as alien to her as the scorching deserts of Essos must be to him. And she allowed a flicker of hope that this alliance might prove more than a convenience. Might it be the path to a better future for all of Westeros? She believed it might. She believed that if they navigated the complexities with care, her father's madness need not define House Targaryen forever, and the Stark's old bitterness need not consume them. If the Seven Kingdoms were to be healed, it would be by forging new ties in the fires of adversity, not by repeating the sins of the past. Back in Westeros, the war's drumbeat did not cease, even as Robb Stark sailed north from Lys. Word reached him upon docking at White Harbor that Tywin Lannister had pressed an offensive deeper into the Riverlands, hoping to catch Robb's armies scattered. Roose Bolton had moved south to meet them, uncertain of Robb's whereabouts. Robb cursed under his breath when he heard. Secrecy had been paramount, but it left him absent from a key moment in the war. He swiftly gathered his men, riding hard through the north to rally the loyal lords. They converged near Moat Cailin, a vital fortress that controlled passage between the north and the south. Robb found the Great John and other bannermen who greeted their king with relief. Their expressions turned to surprise when he shared discreetly that he had met with Daenerys Targaryen and come to certain agreements. 3 dragons, the Great John said, eyes gleaming with a mixture of awe and terror. That'll put the fear into Lannister hearts. Robb tempered the conversation. We cannot depend on illusions. She has not yet sailed, and we still face immediate threats. The Lannisters will not wait for dragons to decide our fate. I will not break faith with Daenerys Targaryen, but I must still fight this war in the meantime. When the time comes for her to land in Westeros, we will coordinate. Until then, we stand alone. Let no word of our meeting slip to the Lannisters or the Freys or any who might betray us. They rode south, rejoining the battered front in the Riverlands, and soon Robb found himself embroiled once more in the harsh realities of war. Tywin Lannister's host was formidable, and the River Lords were tired of conflict ravaging their fields. The smell of smoke and death lay heavy on the land, but Robb knew in his heart that there was a glimmer of hope on the horizon. An alliance with dragons. He dared not speak it openly, but the knowledge sustained him. If the realm's rightful queen arrived with her fires of retribution, the Lannisters could be brought to heel at last. Even as he fought, he spent hours with quill and parchment, writing to Daenerys Targaryen. He reported on the movements of armies, the shifting alliances. He asked about her progress in stabilizing Meereen. She replied in her own letters that more battles flared in Slaver's Bay, that certain noble families sought to overthrow her rule and reinstate the old ways. She had put down one rebellion, only to see new conspiracies arise. Yet she wrote, time and again, that she would not abandon the people she had freed. They deserved better than to be left to the mercies of slavers. She would come to Westeros, but only when her rule in Meereen was secure. She owed that much to the freedmen who called her Mysa. Robb found that, in reading her letters, he gained insight not just into her situation, but into her character. She was driven, compassionate but fierce, utterly unwilling to compromise on the matter of slavery. He admired that. The more they wrote, the more a sense of mutual respect and strange friendship blossomed. Though they were half a world apart, they spoke of shared burdens. Leadership, betrayal, the hope for a kinder order. Sometimes he would read her letters deep into the night, a slight smile on his face, wondering how a woman he scarcely knew could feel so familiar in her convictions. In the darkest moments, with the war pressing on all sides, her words reminded him why he fought in the first place. Of course, there were also moments of frustration, when he needed her armies, her dragons, yet she was mired in Slaver's Bay. He had to remind himself that alliances often demanded patience. He thought of how his father must have felt, forging alliances with Robert and Jon Arryn during the rebellion, uncertain of the outcome. As months stretched on, the realm seemed no closer to peace. Stannis Baratheon had carved out a foothold in Dragonstone, rumored to be flirting with dark sorceries. The Tyrells, newly aligned with King Joffrey, brought bountiful supplies into King's Landing, shoring up Lannister power. Balon Greyjoy still harried the northern coasts. The Freys sulked at the twins, resentful that Robb had broken a marriage pact. Tension gnawed at every corner of the war. Yet Robb pressed on, forging small victories, forging trust with the River Lords who clung to him as their best hope. In quiet corners of ravaged villages, the small folk whispered of the king in the North's alliance with a dragon queen. Some called it rumor, some prayed it was true. The idea that dragons might come to punish the Lannisters offered a kind of grim comfort to those who had lost homes and livelihoods. But so far, it remained only a rumor. Across the sea, Daenerys Targaryen stood on the walls of Meereen, her face glistening with sweat. Her victory over a rebellious faction was complete. The sun beat down upon the city, and her dragons circled overhead, screeching triumph. She still felt the sting of the sacrifices made. Good men had died, but the city was hers once more. "Your Grace," Missandei said gently, approaching from behind. "The rebellion has ended. The people gather in the plazas. Some chant your name." Daenerys's gaze swept over the rooftops. "Then we must ensure we do not abandon them. I must leave solid structures in place, a council that can govern fairly in my absence. I have lost enough time. Westeros calls." She thought of the letters she had received from Robb Stark, describing the sufferings of the Riverlands, the monstrous acts of Gregor Clegane in service to the Lannisters, the way Tywin's gold had bought allies. She was tired of hearing about the crimes inflicted on innocent people in her name's absence. She was the rightful queen, and these were her subjects, even if they had never seen her, even if they did not yet know her. A Targaryen should protect the realm, not devour it. She felt an ache of longing to cross the sea, to set foot on the land she had dreamed of her entire life. After ensuring that Meereen had stable governance, appointing men and women of both freed and noble classes, Daenerys began gathering her forces in earnest for the voyage. The Unsullied would accompany her, as would the Second Sons. She had Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion, now fully capable of unleashing torrents of flame. She had ships commissioned and outfitted, though the number was still modest compared to a full invasion fleet. Yet she sensed that time was ripe, and if the rumors of an alliance with the North were true, more ships might be available on the western side of the sea. She would not be sailing blind. Robb Stark had promised to muster every available vessel from White Harbor, the Manderleys holding the largest port in the north. The day she finally left Meereen behind dawned bright and hot, the desert wind carrying the scent of baked earth and the distant tang of sea. She stood at the prow of her flagship clad in scaled leather, a blend of fashion and armor, her hair braided tight. Drogon soared overhead, screeching as if bidding farewell to Essos. She did not look back at the city that had taken so much from her. She looked forward to the open sea, to the future. She imagined the day she would set foot in Westeros, and a swirl of anticipation rose in her chest. Daenerys Targaryen at last returning to claim her birthright. But this time she would not come alone. She carried with her the alliance she had forged with the king in the north. She carried the trust that had grown letter by letter, shaped by the memory of Ned Stark's honor, by the possibility of reviving Robert Baratheon's dream of a united realm, but doing it right this time. She knew war awaited her. The Lannisters would not yield without a fight. But if she and Robb Stark coordinated their efforts, if the North rose in tandem with her dragon's fire, perhaps the walls of King's Landing would fall quickly. The wheel might finally be broken, the cycle of oppression shattered. She would bring justice. She would uphold her vow to the North. And in doing so, she might prove that the Targaryen name could stand for more than madness and fire, it could stand for rebirth. With sails unfurled and the crash of waves against the hull, Daenerys's fleet departed Slaver's Bay. Gulls cried in the wake. She inhaled a breath of salt air, her heart pounding with resolve. Essos receded behind them, a land of heartbreak and triumph. Westeros lay ahead with all its perils and promises. She felt her dragons circle the sky, their shadows playing over the deck like fleeting glimpses of destiny. She wondered what Robb Stark was doing at that very moment, likely overseeing the defense of the Riverlands or preparing White Harbor for her arrival. She wondered if the alliance would hold under the strain of real war. She believed it would. She had come to trust his word as he seemed to trust hers. She closed her eyes and saw the crest of House Stark, the dire wolf, beside the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen. Two ancient sigils, once enemies, now bound by the hope that the realm might not tear itself apart under Lannister rule. Then she opened her eyes and saw only the vast water ahead. "Onward," she murmured. "Onward to our new beginning." Word of Daenerys Targaryen's fleet crossing the narrow sea arrived in Westeros as a whisper on the wind, then as a roaring rumor. From King's Landing to the Vale, from Dorne to the Neck, lords and ladies trembled at the thought of dragons returning to the land they had once set ablaze. Cersei Lannister, ruling as Queen Mother over the young King Tommen, spat curses. Qyburn toiled in dark chambers, seeking means to fell dragons with monstrous contraptions. Jaime Lannister mustered men, the gold of Casterly rock greasing every palm it could. The Tyrells, bound to the Lannisters by marriage, weighed their options but soon realized war was unavoidable. Stannis Baratheon, holed up at Dragonstone, heard the news with grim interest. The Targaryen girl had come at last. But would she be friend or foe to the one who considered himself the rightful king? The Red Woman, Melisandre, read signs in the flames, speaking cryptic words. Stannis found no comfort there. Dorne stirred, for the Martells had their own grievances against the Lannisters, their own history with the Targaryens. Some in Dorne whispered that they should bend the knee to Daenerys, that they should avenge the deaths of Elia Martell and her children. Others counseled caution, fearing the dragons might burn them, too. The Iron Island smoldered with Balon Greyjoy's ambitions. Yara Greyjoy heard rumor that the Dragon Queen might strike alliances with any who turned against the Lannisters. She wondered if it was wise to join with Daenerys or to remain the Reaver of the North. The old ways died hard. And in the north, Robb Stark stood on the walls of White Harbor, cloaked in wolfskin, gazing at the horizon. His mother stood beside him, anxious but steadfast. The Great John, the Manderleys, and other northern lords gathered on the docks below, bristling with spears and banners. Every ship in the harbor had been readied, every archer stationed, because no one knew exactly how Daenerys would arrive. She had written that her first landing would be in Dorne or Dragonstone, but she intended to send smaller vessels to meet Robb in White Harbor soon after. They would coordinate, gather intelligence, plan their next strikes. The day it finally happened was cold and clear, the sea a mirror of steel beneath a pale sky. A small convoy of ships appeared in the distance, bearing unfamiliar banners. As they drew nearer, watchers on the battlements could make out the Targaryen sigil. Robb's heart thudded in his chest. The murmurs among the men rose. Stories of dragons, half-true or overblown, sparked uneasy shifts in posture. Some men gripped their sword hilts, others crossed themselves for good fortune. Then, in a blaze of awe, a dragon soared overhead. Even from a distance, its roar shook the air, sending flocks of gulls scattering in panic. Robb felt his blood run cold. He had read about dragons, heard them described in Daenerys' letters, but to see one in flight, black scales shining in the northern sun, great leathery wings pounding the sky, was unlike anything he could have imagined. A hush fell across the harbor as men looked up, transfixed by something out of legend. Catelyn Stark's hand tightened on Robb's arm. "Seven save us," she whispered. Yet there was a certain wonder in her eyes, too. As the ships glided into the harbor, banners fluttered in the biting wind. Robb descended to the docks, flanked by his most loyal men, to meet Daenerys Targaryen. The first to come ashore were unsullied, their discipline evident in every precise step. Northerners gaped at them, eunuch soldiers, silent and unwavering, wholly foreign to this land. Then came Daenerys herself, with Ser Barristan at her side, Daario behind, and a small retinue of advisors. She wore a fur-lined cloak over her usual attire, for the northern chill was no small shock after the heat of Essos. Her silver-gold hair caught the light of day as she scanned the assembled northerners. Robb stepped forward. Their eyes met. The last time they had seen each other in person was in Lys, months ago. The burdens of their separate wars had left new lines on their faces, but the sight of one another sparked a flicker of recognition, of kinship forged across the sea. In the hush that fell over the crowd, Robb inclined his head courteously, though not so low as to imply subservience. "Queen Daenerys," he said. "Welcome to the north." She offered a nod. "King Robb." Her breath misted in the cold air. "I thank you for your hospitality." He saw the fear and curiosity mingling among his men. They stared at the unsullied, at the dragons overhead. He saw Rhaegal and Viserion circling in the sky behind Drogon, their silhouettes dark against the sun. He recognized that all of this must seem terrifying, alien. But he would not cower. He gestured for Daenerys and her party to follow him. "We have prepared chambers in the Manderley Manse, near the harbor. A feast awaits you, though it may be modest by Essosi standards." She smiled, a hint of warmth in it. "I shall enjoy the North's hospitality." "Let on, your grace." Thus they moved from the docks to the grand building that had been readied for Daenerys, with tight-lipped northern guards on one side, unsullied on the other. Townsfolk peered from windows and doorways, marveling at the procession. Some children cried out in terror at the dragons overhead, others squealed in delight. At the manse, they gathered in a large hall. The Manderleys had seen it stocked with roasted meats, fish pies, and barrels of ale. The cold hall smelled of pine and salt. Lords and ladies of the north, uncertain and stoic, watched as Daenerys was escorted to the high table. Robb introduced her to the Manderleys, the Great John, and others. She greeted them with courtesy, her posture regal, her accent hinting at Essos but still understandable in the common tongue. When the feast began, the tension in the air did not vanish, but it softened. Daenerys tasted northern dishes politely, praising them with surprising sincerity. The Great John bellowed about how a dragon might fare in the snows of winter. Daenerys, with a subtle smile, replied that her dragons would fare just fine so long as she fed them well. Some of the northern lords chuckled at that. Others eyed her warily, mindful of old tales about dragons burning entire armies. Later, in a more private chamber, Robb and Daenerys sat down with their close advisors, poring over maps of Westeros spread across a sturdy wooden table. Torches flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The chill draft was ever-present, but fur cloaks and braziers kept it at bay. Daenerys' eyes flicked to the Wolf's Den, White Harbor's formidable fortress, then traced the coastline down to King's Landing. "We need a coordinated plan," she said. "I have some men, but not enough to fight a full-scale war alone. Dragons will help, but an entire kingdom cannot be conquered by 3 beasts alone. We must be tactical." Robb nodded, pointing to the Blackwater region. King's Landing is heavily fortified. The Lannisters command thousands of men, plus the Gold Cloaks. They have the Tyrells' support as well for now. We could attempt to rally Dorne or to pry the Tyrells away from the throne. My sister, Sansa, is rumored to be at court. I fear for her safety. Daenerys looked up sharply. A hostage? Yes, Robb murmured, anguish flickering in his voice. She's married off to the Lannisters. It's not something I can forget or forgive. Ser Barristan cleared his throat. Then perhaps the first order of business is to secure alliances with other great houses who resent the Lannisters. If the Tyrells can be turned, that would split King's Landing wide open. If they remain loyal, however, we must rely on Dorne or the Vale. The Vale has been quiet since Lysa Arryn's death, but young Lord Robert is manipulated by Peter Baelish. Talk continued far into the night, with Robb's bannermen drifting in and out. Some voiced anger that the Targaryen was dictating war strategy, others recognized they needed her. Daenerys listened to the dissent, meeting it with measured responses. She did not demand immediate fealty. She spoke of justice and a better realm, pointed out that the war had already cost the North dearly and that, with her help, they could spare thousands more lives that might be lost in a grueling stalemate. Robb watched her with growing respect. She handled herself with a firm but calm hand, refusing to be rattled by blunt northern speech. She had not come like the conqueror, smashing down their doors. She had come as an ally. He saw her ambition and her strength. He also saw the compassion that had led her to free slaves, to lift up the downtrodden. More than once, he caught her casting glances his way, as if seeking his reactions. He found himself meeting those glances with solidarity, forging a subtle connection in the midst of the planning. When the final war councils ended, the plan they had shaped was this. Daenerys would move her Unsullied and dragons south along the coast, hitting strategic Lannister strongholds. Robb's armies would move to threaten the Riverlands and the Crownlands, forcing Tywin to divide his forces. They would attempt to win over Dorne by sending envoys reminding them of Elia Martell's murder, and how the Lannisters had never answered for it. If Dorne joined, the southern approach to King's Landing would be sealed. If the Tyrells stayed loyal to the Lannisters, Daenerys' forces would engage them carefully, possibly using naval power or the threat of dragons. Meanwhile, the North would maintain pressure from the west. Every victory would be a step closer to toppling King Tommen and the Lannister grip on the throne. Then Daenerys would claim the Iron Throne, with the support of the North's armies behind her. It was an audacious plan, riddled with risk, but it was more than they had before, and it was a testament to the unthinkable alliance that had formed between House Stark and House Targaryen, built on the tragic memory of Ned Stark's death and the cautionary legacy of Robert Baratheon's flawed unity. Late that night, as the fires in White Harbor's hearths burned low, Robb stood on a balcony overlooking the city. The harbor was dotted with Daenerys' ships, their lanterns drifting like scattered stars upon the dark water. Gray wind curled at his feet, a silent guard. Robb's thoughts raced, too tangled for sleep. He turned at the sound of soft footsteps and found Daenerys there, draped in a fur cloak to ward off the cold, her silver-gold hair dim in the moonlight. He inclined his head, stepping aside so she might share the balcony. "I couldn't sleep," she murmured. "The cold is a novelty to me. I've never been this far north." He exhaled a cloud of breath into the night air. You'll grow used to it, or at least learn to endure it. We Northerners say it keeps us tough. She let out a quiet laugh, looking over the sleeping city. We have a great task ahead. The Lannisters are cunning. They'll not yield easily. No, Robb agreed. We must be resolute. But if we succeed... He trailed off, his mind dancing with half-formed ideas of a realm free from Lannister cruelty, of a stable monarchy that recognized the North's rights, of a peace that might allow him to return to Winterfell one day. Daenerys looked at him. The moonlight cast shadows on her face, accentuating the determination in her eyes. If we succeed, we will have achieved something people once thought impossible. Robb studied her for a long moment, sensing the echoes of history swirling around them. Their father's generation had bathed the realm in blood. The rebellion, the sack of King's Landing, the collapse of House Targaryen. Now, decades later, the two of them stood as unlikely partners. It felt surreal, as though the old ghosts watched from beyond. I still think of my father, Robb said softly. He was an honorable man, too honorable for the games in King's Landing. Perhaps if he had known you, if he had known there was a Targaryen who believed in justice, things might have gone differently. Daenerys lowered her gaze. I think of how my father's madness destroyed families, your father's, among so many. The sins of House Targaryen are not easily forgiven. I can't undo them, but I can try to show the realm a new way. They stood in silence for a moment, letting the wind blow past, letting the ghosts fade to the edges of thought. At dawn, Robb said, we march. The war will begin in earnest. And if the gods are good, we will eventually meet again in King's Landing, standing victorious, with a future to shape. She nodded, a fierce light in her expression. Let us not waste what we've built here. He extended his hand and she took it, their fingers clasping in a moment of unspoken camaraderie. Two young rulers, each bearing the weight of bloodlines and crowns, forging an alliance that could reshape the continent. The chill wind wrapped around them, and somewhere above, a dragon roared at the moon, answered by a distant howl of a dire wolf. In that mingling of roars and howls, in the hush of the northern night, the future of Westeros trembled on the precipice of a new age, an age born from Ned Stark's steadfast honor and Robert Baratheon's legacy of unity, tempered now by the dragon's flame and the wolf's steel. And in that moment, for all the terrors still lurking in the shadows, hope glimmered in the darkness like the first star of dawn. At dawn, the clamor of assembling armies filled White Harbor's streets. Frost coated the flagstones, and the tang of the sea mingled with the raw scent of horse flesh and morning fires. Northerners and Unsullied crowded side by side under the watchful gaze of lords, knights, and captains. Sailors hurried along the quays, rigging ships for supply runs, while blacksmiths hammered steel in the courtyard of the Manderley Manse, finishing repairs on weapons for the impending campaign. In the crisp air, the breath of men and beasts rose in plumes as if the city itself exhaled. Daenerys Targaryen stood with her retinue in the open courtyard, dressed in heavy woolens beneath a cloak of silver-gray fur. Even so, her cheeks were tinged pink with the bite of the northern cold. Nearby, the Unsullied were silent and still as statues, waiting for her command. The quiet discipline of those eunuch soldiers stood in stark contrast to the northern warriors who were exchanging boisterous farewells with their kin or haggling for better gear. Yet side by side, they would soon march south. Robb Stark emerged from the manse, his wolfskin cloak draped over battle leathers, gray wind padding at his side. He paused as he reached Daenerys, taking in the sight of her men and dragons. Above, one of the smaller dragons, Viserion, circled lazily, letting out occasional rumbles that sent ripples of unease through the harbor. Even with the knowledge of their alliance, the presence of dragons so near made many Northerners twitchy. Are your troops ready? Robb asked. He spoke in a subdued tone, mindful that the entire courtyard might overhear them if he raised his voice. Daenerys glanced toward Ser Barristan and Selmy, who stood a short distance behind her, calmly surveying the bustle. Then she looked back at Robb. They are. Our scouts and quartermasters say the roads south can still support wagons, as there hasn't been heavy snowfall yet. My ships will sail along the coast once we depart. They'll shadow our route, bringing supplies. Robb nodded. Good. The roads in the eastern north are more forgiving than the western passes. Once we cross the neck, we'll be in contested territory. We'll need to take care. He gestured for Daenerys to walk with him, and the two set out across the courtyard. They slipped around a cluster of chattering men, then through the gates to a raised walk that overlooked White Harbor's harbor walls. The sky was pale, the sun barely clearing the horizon, casting an ashen glow over the gray city. Below, the water reflected shifting shards of early light. Rob's voice was quiet. "The plan is to march out by midday. My mother and the Blackfish will remain here a short time, finalizing supply lines. We have some loyal houses further inland who will join us en route." Daenerys folded her arms beneath her cloak. "And I will advance with my Unsullied and the Second Sons, supported by your Outriders. Meanwhile, my dragons can scout from above. We'll keep pace alongside the White Knife until we reach the King's Road, then continue south. Once we near Moat Cailin, we'll regroup with Lord Bolton's men. He's been stationed there." At the mention of Roose Bolton, Rob's brow creased slightly. "Yes," he said after a small hesitation. "He's indicated readiness to fight the Lannisters, but we'll want to keep a keen eye on him. He's not the most forthcoming of my bannermen." Daenerys thought of Roose Bolton's pale, unsettling stare, glimpsed in passing the night before. She had found him as enigmatic and frigid as the northern wind. "We'll watch him closely," she agreed. "Though I suppose such is the nature of warfare and politics. There are always shifting loyalties." Rob turned to her. "True. But this alliance, ours, must be steadfast if we mean to bring down the Lannisters. If we fracture, they'll exploit every division." She met his gaze. "I won't waver. My men and I are committed. I do warn you, however, that if I sense betrayal from any quarter, I will act swiftly. I've seen too many false friends and broken promises in Essos." A faint smile tugged at Rob's lips. "From what I've seen of you, I don't doubt it." He glanced at the harbor once more, where a few of Daenerys' ships bobbed on the waves, carrying the red and black banner of House Targaryen. The remains of her fleet stretched out of view, anchored further from shore. It was a smaller fleet than the Royal Navy in King's Landing, but it had carried her armies across the narrow sea. Now, with White Harbor as a staging ground, they had a new mission: to ferry supplies, men, and eventually to strike at Lannister positions along the eastern coast of Westeros. Rob exhaled, releasing a breath that misted in the cold. "Then let us begin. We'll muster in the square at midday. By sundown, we'll be on the road." Daenerys nodded, and for a moment they simply stood there, two monarchs joined in tenuous alliance, overlooking the city. Her eyes lifted toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond that line of gray waters lay King's Landing, a city she had seen only in her dreams, the seat of power that had once belonged to her forebears. The time was at hand to reclaim it. But first, she and Robb Stark must test whether their unity could truly stand firm against the chaos of war. They parted ways soon after, each moving to oversee last-minute preparations. Daenerys conferred with Daario Naharis, who swaggered about in his flamboyant finery, adjusting his swords as if expecting to duel at any moment. Ser Barristan and approached her with a small list of concerns: the safe transport of the dragons once they grew weary of flight, the well-being of the freedmen who had followed her from Essos, and the route they might take if heavy rains turned the roads to mud. Daenerys answered each patiently, mindful that leadership required 1,000 daily choices. All around them, the city stirred with excitement and tension. Fishermen paused in their labor to watch the foreign queen and her soldiers. Northern wives hurried to deliver fresh loaves of bread and salted fish to the men assembling in the squares. Old men leaned on walking sticks, discussing the unthinkable sight of dragons overhead. Children ran through narrow lanes, shrieking whenever the shadow of scaled wings passed across the sky. By midday, the mass of men had formed into columns outside White Harbor's walls, stretching along the road that branched toward the King's Road. Banners of the direwolf snapped in the breeze beside the three-headed dragon. Northern cavalry, led by the likes of the Great John and other stout lords, waited in uneasy proximity to the unsullied spear formations. The Second Sons, swaggering mercenaries, trotted on horseback behind Daario, who occasionally doffed his plumed helmet and flourished about to the stunned northerners. Riding at the forefront on a sturdy northern courser, Daenerys felt the eyes of thousands upon her. She wore a half-cloak edged with wolf fur, gifted that morning by a local seamstress who had insisted the foreign queen needed better protection from the cold. The cloak was surprisingly comfortable, although Daenerys found the weight of it a reminder that this was not the warm land of Essos she once knew. At her side rode Robb, cloaked in darker fur, Grey Wind loping along on foot. Ser Barristan and the Blackfish followed behind, each flanked by their own small retinues. Trumpets sounded, the gates of White Harbor clanked open, and the army began its march. A roar arose from the crowds gathered to witness the departure, a mixture of cheers and prayers, as if the people of White Harbor could not decide whether to celebrate or seek the mercy of the gods. Overhead, Rhaegal and Viserion flew in languid circles, while Drogon, the largest of the dragons, soared further out, occasionally dipping close enough that the wind of his passing rattled the banners. Within an hour, the city receded behind them, replaced by rolling fields dusted in frost. The White Knife River gleamed in patches through the trees on their right, while to their left, lightly wooded hills rose, slumbering under an early winter hush. The column stretched far, men in furs and men in leather, some on foot, some mounted, others driving wagons loaded with tents, supplies, and war engines. Even though Daenerys had commanded armies in Essos, she felt a fresh sense of wonder at the stark grandeur of the north and the men who called it home. She heard snatches of northern songs echoing down the lines, half lost in the steady clop of hooves. Robb broke the silence between them after a long spell of riding. There's a village not far ahead called Stony Shore. We'll make camp beyond it, near a bend in the river. Safe from flooding, with enough open ground for the dragons. Our outriders have already scouted it. Daenerys inclined her head. Very well. Once we set camp, I'd like to meet again with your captains and mine. We should coordinate how we'll handle Moat Cailin and what we expect from Lord Bolton. Robb's lips thinned slightly. We'll do so. For now, if you have questions about the land or the houses we'll encounter, I can answer. She cast a glance ahead toward the expanse of land rolling out before them. Tell me of House Manderley. I understand they are sworn to you, but they're rather unique among the North, no? Robb's expression lifted somewhat. They are. Long ago, the Manderleys were originally from the south around the Mander River in the Reach. They were exiled and my forebears granted them lands at the mouth of the White Knife. They're northerners but hold some southern customs like knighthood and a taste for grand feasts. They're loyal, though, and wealthy. White Harbor's the North's only true city. Daenerys nodded. And the Grey John? He seems boisterous. Robb smiled wryly. Lord Umber. He was one of the first to proclaim me king in the North. Despite his loud ways, he's loyal. Never doubt he'll fight like a maddened bear. He's a man who'd challenge a dragon to single combat if he'd had enough ale, but don't mistake that for disloyalty. Daenerys found herself warming to the conversation. It reminded her of the early days in Meereen when she strove to understand each faction, each noble family, each freedman's group, so she could govern them. She realized that same caution would serve her well now in Westeros. The remainder of the day's march passed in relative peace, though the air grew colder as the sun dipped behind leaden clouds. When they reached the chosen campsite near dusk, Daenerys watched as tents sprang up across a broad meadow bordered by the river and a low rise of rocky ground. Soldiers fanned out, building fires, staking lines for the horses, forming neat rows for the Unsullied's encampment. The second sons pitched their tents on slightly higher ground while the northern lords congregated in a wide circle around a large communal fire. The dragons glided overhead, their silhouettes cut against a bruised orange sky. Daenerys set up her own pavilion close to Robb's command tent. She knew that some men gawked in curiosity at the heavy canvas tents from Essos dyed pale shades of cream and gray. Inside, Missandei and her other handmaids carefully laid out Daenerys's bedding and a portable brazier to keep out the biting chill. Daario popped his head in at one point, complaining about the thin air of the north, but Daenerys only laughed at him and told him to fetch more firewood. Shortly after, Daenerys and Robb gathered their principal commanders in a nearby tent designated for war councils. It was a spacious pavilion with a thick wooden table in the center, lit by torch and lantern. The sounds of the bustling camp drifted in through the tent flaps, the pounding of hammers, the low murmur of men's voices, the occasional whinny of horses startled by the looming dragons. Ser Barristan, Daario Naharis, and Missandei stood behind Daenerys. Robb was flanked by the Blackfish and a few northern lords, Lady Meege Mormont, tall and broad-shouldered, and Lord Serwyn, looking barely old enough to hold his father's seat but determined not to show fear. The Great John was absent, off organizing supplies. Others crowded in the background, forming a loose ring around the table. A large map of the north and the Trident had been unrolled. Stones marked the positions of known Lannister forces further south as well as Boltons stationed at Moat Cailin. Robb gestured at the neck, that narrow isthmus dividing the north from the southern kingdoms, a land of bogs, swamps, and hidden causeways. If Lord Bolton has done as he promised, Moat Cailin is secure, he said. But the Ironborn raided it recently. I do not yet know how well his men have restored the fortress. The swamps around the moat, though, are as good as any walls so long as we control the causeway. We should be able to pass through to the south with minimal trouble, assuming Bolton is loyal and the Ironborn haven't returned. Daenerys, studying the map, frowned slightly. And if Lord Bolton is not as trustworthy as we hope? The older lords exchanged glances. Brynden Tully, known as the Blackfish, spoke, his tone dry. We keep careful watch. We have outriders who will meet us on the road ahead with fresh updates. If Bolton has any treachery planned, we'll find out. But for now, let us assume it's as he claims, that he's prepared to join our combined forces in pushing south. Dario leaned over the map, tapping it with a gloved finger. A caution, your graces. The neck is a bottleneck. If anyone wants to trap us, that is where they'll do it. Robb nodded, which is why we're taking a sizable force. Even if Bolton decided to be difficult, he'd be outnumbered. But a pitched battle at Moat Cailin would mean precious delays. Daenerys ran her fingertip along the route. After the Moat, the King's Road takes us through the Riverlands. We'll be in war-torn territory. The Blackfish inclined his head. Indeed, my nephew has been fighting there for over a year. The land is scarred by Lannister retribution. The smallfolk can offer little now with winter nearing. Food is scarce. That reality weighed heavily on Daenerys. She imagined the hungry peasants, their fields burned, forced to feed not just the Lannisters but now a second or third army. She recalled the lessons she had learned in Essos. Sometimes the best route to victory was to secure the goodwill of the common folk. If we can, I'd like to ensure the Riverlords know we're not simply another scourge. If possible, I'll have my men pay for supplies rather than take them. We can't always control pillaging, but we can try. The lords looked at each other. Robb ventured a cautious nod. They'll respect that. And if it helps us gain more support, so much the better. Riverrun itself remains in our hands, though it's threatened by Lannister forces. They spoke on forging plans for the next weeks of marching. The entire time, Daenerys felt the tea and Sion thrumming in the tent. An unspoken awareness that war was about to begin in earnest. Even though conflict already raged in the Riverlands, the presence of dragons and Unsullied changed the nature of it. She could sense the hope in the Northern Lord's eyes and the lingering fear. Northern loyalty was fierce, but the Targaryen name carried weighty echoes of fire and blood. Should the alliance fail, or should she prove unworthy, the North might be doomed to a new brand of tyranny. When the council concluded, Daenerys dismissed her commanders. Robb lingered, speaking quietly with his uncle, the Blackfish, who murmured words she could not catch. Lady Mormont offered Daenerys a short, curt nod of respect as she left, though the lines on the older woman's face spoke of skepticism. In time, only Robb, Daenerys, Ser Barristan, and Missandei remained. The tent felt suddenly quieter, the hustle of the army replaced by the crackle of the brazier. Robb traced a path on the map. We'll travel for at least a week before we even reach Moat Cailin. If all goes well, I expect we'll cross into the Riverlands in about 3 weeks' time. Winter is creeping closer by the day, though. The further south we go, the milder it will be, but storms could strike. Daenerys smiled wryly. I've ridden through scorching deserts, but never a northern snowstorm. I am hoping to avoid that experience for as long as I can. Robb's stern features softened briefly, as though amused. Then he let out a breath. It's been a long day. We should rest. So they parted, each retiring to their pavilions. Daenerys entered hers to find the brazier glowing, Missandei ordering the final bits of bedding. Outside, the wind whistled through the meadow grasses. She drifted off to sleep that night listening to the distant roar of Drogon, a haunting counterpoint to the whine of winter's approach. The next week of marching tested the alliance in small ways. The Northerners were unaccustomed to the disciplined formality of the Unsullied, who never drank, never joined in the evening revelries, and stood watch with uncanny stoicism. Meanwhile, the Unsullied soldiers watched the Northmen's jests and rowdy campfire gatherings with impassive curiosity. The Second Sons, for their part, fit in better with the more unruly elements, sharing loud laughter and boasts in half a dozen tongues. At times, tensions flared. An accidental insult here, a drunken scuffle there. But Robb's and Daenerys's captains smoothed matters quickly. Each morning the columns reformed, and the great host marched onward. Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion Seldom all flew together. Daenerys often dispatched one dragon to scout ahead, though she took care to keep them from venturing too far. Sometimes, she would ride her silver mare while Drogon glided above, scanning the countryside. Villages dotted the route, their inhabitants equal parts amazed and terrified. The men who trudged behind the supply wagons spoke of seeing mothers sweep their children inside at the first sight of dragon wings. Daenerys thought of the slaves she had freed across the narrow sea, the wonder in their eyes when they first realized she was there not to devour them but to liberate. Here in Westeros, she had no such claim to being a liberator. These people were not slaves, though the horrors of war had worn them down. She sensed their caution, and she did not blame them. Robb Stark rode often at her side. He pointed out landmarks, recounted small bits of history, a ruined tower that had once belonged to a lesser lord, an ancient weirwood grove set near a swollen stream, a lonely barrow mound. He spoke little of his personal griefs, but Daenerys felt them in him all the same. In the quiet moments, she thought of how he must yearn for Winterfell, the seat of his ancestors, now sacked and scorched by the Ironborn. She knew the ache of losing one's home. It bound them in subtle kinship. On the 5th day, messengers brought word that small Lannister scouting parties had been spotted further south, near the borders of the Neck. None dared harry them so deep in the north, but it was a sign that Tywin's men watched for movement. The war was coming into sharper focus. Daenerys could feel it like a tightening cord around her chest. On the 7th day, they crested a ridge and saw before them a desolate marshland stretching into the distance, the gateway to the Neck. Twilight tinted the swamps a murky purple, and low mists curled over stagnant water. Towering reeds and gnarled trees jutted from the bog. Far in the distance rose the faint silhouette of Moat Cailin's ancient towers, half-ruined but still formidable. Daenerys reined in her mare beside Robb, observing the moors below. It was a depressing scene, cold and waterlogged. Robb's voice was quiet. "We'll camp tonight on this high ground. Tomorrow we press into the marsh. The causeway is narrow. If Lord Bolton meets us as planned, he'll guide us through. If not..." He let the words hang. The unspoken possibility they might have to fight their way through or attempt a different approach entirely. Daenerys set her jaw. "I've come this far, I won't be turned away by bog and treachery." A grim smile played on Robb's lips. "No, I don't expect so." That night, the camp was uneasy. Mist seeped around tents, making the air clammy and chill. Some of the horses stomped in discontent. A biting wind pushed through the marsh. Daenerys found herself sitting near a fire pit outside her tent, warming her hands over the flames. Missandei was beside her, tucked into a thick cloak. Ser Barristan stood watch a short distance away. Even Daario had quieted. He cleaned a blade on the far side of the fire, occasionally humming a tune from the Free Cities. The Great John wandered by, half-drunk, and gave Daenerys a loud greeting. "So, my queen," he roared in that booming voice, "you'll see soon enough why the Neck is no place for decent folk. Frogs and snakes and biting flies. Bah!" He spat into the dirt. "Still, I've fished these marshes. Lived off mud crawlers and boiled frogs for days. Back when I was a young pup chasing outlaws. We'll manage." Daenerys offered a polite smile, though she imagined that the Greyjohn's idea of managing might be more than she wished to experience. "Your confidence is inspiring, my lord." He let out a hearty laugh, then tramped away, calling for more ale. Daenerys watched him go, reflecting on the north's rough edges. A moment later, Robb appeared from the darkness, gray wind padding beside him. The direwolf's eyes glowed eerily in the firelight. He inclined his head to her. "My lords are anxious," he admitted. "The Neck's a place of old legends. Crannogmen are said to haunt these swamps, fighting from the shadows. But the Crannogmen are loyal to House Stark." He added a bit wearily, "We'll see if any show themselves." Daenerys nodded. "The Neck once repelled the Undulls, if I recall the stories. It said even a small force can hold off a large army here." Robb settled onto a stump near the fire, letting gray wind curl at his feet. "Aye, so if the Lannisters were foolish enough to come at us from the south, we'd make them bleed. But that does us little good if we cannot pass ourselves. We just have to trust that Bolton's done his duty." They lapsed into silence, the crackle of flames filling the void. Daenerys absently rubbed her arms, longing for the warmth of the brazier in her tent. But something about the hush of the campsite, the flickering glow against the dark marsh, held her in place. She caught Robb studying her for a moment, his expression contemplative, as though searching for something in her face. "You don't regret coming here?" he asked softly. "To the north, this alliance. You could have chosen another path. Perhaps forged deals with other kings, or tried to sail straight to King's Landing." Daenerys hesitated. In truth, she had questioned her decisions 1,000 times over. But she recalled the months she had spent in Meereen, fighting a war of liberation only to find the complexities of governance waiting at every turn. She remembered looking across the sea, longing to reclaim her homeland but knowing she could not do it alone. "I believe in this alliance," she said finally. "Your father was known for his honor, and everything I've seen in you tells me that wasn't a myth. If the North stands beside me, we have a real chance to end Lannister tyranny. So no, I don't regret it." His shoulders seemed to loosen, as if relieved. "Good," he murmured. "You carry a lot of hope for my people. They say the North bleeds from 1,000 cuts. The war, the Ironborn, the uncertainty of winter. They look to me for answers I can't always give. My father's shadow looms large. But He broke off, shaking his head. "Forgive me. I didn't mean to burden you with that." Daenerys found herself offering a small, wry smile. "I know well the weight of expectation. I was taught, even as a child, that my brother and I were all that remained of House Targaryen, that the realm itself awaited our return. It can be a lonely burden to bear. Sometimes it helps to share a little of it." He lifted his gaze to hers. An understanding passed between them, one forged by the shared mantle of rule. Then he cleared his throat, turning toward Grey Wind, scratching the beast's ears. "We should both get rest. Tomorrow's march will not be pleasant." She nodded. "Good night, Robb Stark." He inclined his head in farewell, and she watched him go, the direwolf following at his heels until the darkness swallowed them. Only then did she stand and return to her tent where the faint warmth of the brazier awaited. Outside, the wind picked up, whispering 1,000 secrets through the reeds of the swamp, as though some ancient power remembered the days before dragons and wolves had ever come this way. Dawn arrived gray and damp. Their scouts returned with news. Moat Cailin lay a half-day's march ahead, and Bolton's banners flew over the main tower. The causeway seemed intact, though the ground around it was sodden from recent rains. If they moved cautiously, the wagons and horses should pass without too much trouble. By midday, the army stretched in a thin line across the causeway, the Unsullied maintaining formation despite ankle-deep mud, the Northmen cursing the bog stench, and the Second Sons picking their way along with horses that snorted at the unfamiliar terrain. Daenerys rode near the front, watching in amazement as Drogon soared low overhead, scanning for threats. Tall grasses and stagnant pools pressed in on either side of the narrow road, and every few hundred yards there was a patch of higher ground. The road was so narrow that the columns had to move single file in some places. In the distance, Moat Cailin's towers rose, 3 battered remnants of what was once a mighty fortress. 2 towers were partially collapsed, the walls crumbling into heaps of stone. The central tower stood more intact, a jagged silhouette against the sky. Once it was said, Moat Cailin alone could repel entire armies of Undul conquerors. Now it was a ruin haunted by serpents and ghosts. But if Roose Bolton held it, and if he was loyal, then it would be their key to the south. As the first ranks approached the ruin, Daenerys saw the flayed man's sigil of House Bolton hanging limp above the central tower. A swirl of unease twisted in her stomach. That banner was a grotesque one, a testament to an ancient, bloody tradition of flaying enemies. She recalled the caution in Robb's voice every time he mentioned Bolton. They would need to tread carefully. In the open space between the broken gate and a half-collapsed tower, a small group of mounted men waited. Their armor bore the pale pink and red of House Bolton. One man in particular sat at the forefront, slender and pale, his hair thinning and his eyes unnerving. Roose Bolton himself. Daenerys pulled her horse to a halt as Robb Stark drew up beside her, signaling their retinues to remain back a dozen paces. Grey Wind let out a low growl at the sight of Bolton, but Robb laid a calming hand on the direwolf's neck. Bolton bowed in the saddle, his tone smooth. "Your Grace," he said to Robb. Then he flicked a glance at Daenerys, a slight smile ghosting his lips. "And your Grace as well. I bid you welcome to Moat Cailin." Robb's face remained impassive. "Lord Bolton, the road was clear, as you promised." Bolton inclined his head. "We've had no sign of the Ironborn for weeks. Their raids receded once they learned the king in the north planned to return. My men have held the moat, though it's in poor condition. There's precious little shelter." He turned his unsettling gaze upon Daenerys. "It is an honor, Queen Daenerys, to host you and your dragons. One seldom sees such wonders in the north." She returned his look evenly. "I am grateful for the safe passage, Lord Bolton." Bolton gestured to his men. "We've prepared a small campsite within the old walls. There are wooden walkways across the worst of the mud. With your king's leave, we can proceed." Robb nodded curtly, and the column began to move forward. Daenerys kept a careful eye on Bolton as they rode, her mind flicking to the warnings from Robb's bannermen. She sensed a calculating mind behind that polite facade, a man whose loyalty might hinge on self-interest. Yet he showed no outward sign of hostility, only mild courtesy. She wondered if he was measuring her just as she measured him. They passed under the ruined gatehouse, water dripping from the stones. Inside, the moat's courtyard was a tangle of rubble and reeds with a few makeshift huts and tents scattered about. Bolton's soldiers stood at attention, eyeing the newcomers warily. Beyond the courtyard, the main tower loomed, half-choked with ivy. Despite its decrepit state, Daenerys felt the ancient power of this place. Walls of enormous, mossy stones hinted at an era long past when the first men had built strongholds to guard against southern invaders. Bolton led them to the center of the courtyard where wooden planks had been laid over boggy ground to create a broad, if rickety, space for tents. He pointed to the largest tent near the tower space. "I've prepared lodging for you if you wish, though it's meager. I can also offer you space in the tower itself, though the upper floors are unsafe." Robb dismounted, handing the reins to a northern squire. He stood tall, gray wind at his side. "That will do for now. Our army is large, we'll have to camp out in the approaches as well. We'll not remain here long if we can help it. The south awaits." Bolton gave a thin-lipped smile. "Yes, about that. A raven arrived 2 days past. Lannister scouts have been sighted in the Riverlands, moving north along the Green Fork. It appears Tywin Lannister suspects your approach, or perhaps he hunts smaller pockets of loyalists. In any case, he draws nearer. If we march soon, we may confront him on favorable ground." Daenerys and Robb exchanged a glance. So the lines of war were beginning to converge. Daenerys turned back to Bolton. "Then we will not linger here more than a day or two. We must finalize supplies, let the men rest, and then move on." Bolton dipped his head. "As you say." He gave a slight bow to Robb. "Your Grace, if you please, I'd like to show you something inside the tower. A map the Ironborn left behind. It might be of interest." Robb hesitated. Daenerys sensed his unease. No doubt he was wary of following Bolton anywhere alone. Finally, he gestured to Daenerys. "Let us both see it." Bolton's mouth curved in something akin to a polite smile. "As you wish. This way." Together, they climbed a set of slippery stone steps to the tower's entrance, gray wind trailing warily. Inside, the space smelled of mildew, the walls streaked with damp. Torchlight revealed a circular chamber with a rough-hewn table in the center. Bolton produced a rolled parchment from a small chest. Daenerys watched as he spread it out. It was a crude map of the swamps around Moat Cailin, marked with symbols that might indicate Ironborn raiding routes. Robb studied it, brow-knitted. Bolton's voice was subdued. "My scouts found it on the body of a drowned Ironborn reaver. It may be worthless. Then again, it might show us hidden channels they used to evade detection." Robb traced a finger along one route. "If they still lurk near the salt spear, they could harry our supply lines. We'll have to remain vigilant." Daenerys noticed Bolton's eyes flick toward her. "The Ironborn fear dragons," he said in a quiet tone. "If you see any sign of them, a few passes from the sky should scatter them like minnows." She gave a curt nod. "My dragons will be watchful." For a moment, the only sound was the drip of water somewhere in the darkness above. Then Bolton spoke again, his voice studiously polite. "It is a rare thing, this union of Targaryen and Stark. My men wonder how it shall shape the future of the realm." Robb glanced up sharply, suspicion glinting in his eyes. "It shall shape it for the better if all goes as intended. The Lannisters must be brought down." Bolton inclined his head, his posture conciliatory. "I couldn't agree more. They executed your father, after all. A monstrous act. I only mean to say, many have wondered if the North would prefer to stand alone, forever separated from the Southern throne. Yet here we are, welcoming a Targaryen queen." Daenerys studied Bolton. His tone was mild, but something in his expression felt serpentine, testing the boundaries. She spoke before Robb could reply. "The North's sovereignty is paramount, Lord Bolton. That has always been part of our discussions. Neither I nor Robb Stark sees any conflict in forging an alliance that respects the North's traditions." Bolton pressed his lips into a thin line. "Of course. You must forgive an old soldier's curiosity. I only wish to serve the cause that will bring stability. The flayed man has followed the dire wolf for centuries, after all." Gray Wind let out a low rumble as though unconvinced. Robb stepped back from the table, rolling the map shut. "Let us be about our tasks," he said curtly. "We march within 2 days." Bolton bowed. "I'll make all necessary preparations." Robb turned, letting Daenerys exit ahead of him, and together they descended the tower steps, leaving Bolton behind in the musty chamber. Outside, the courtyard bustled with the arrival of wagons, men picking their way across wooden planks. Daenerys felt a faint pulse of dread. Something about Roose Bolton, the quiet watchfulness, the veneer of politeness, set her teeth on edge. Yet if he remained loyal, they needed his forces desperately. She resolved then and there to keep a close eye on him. That evening, they pitched their tents within the crumbling walls, though many of the men had to bed down on open ground near the causeway. Rain threatened, so the atmosphere was subdued. Sentries patrolled the perimeter, calling out to each other to avoid stumbling into sinkholes in the dark. Dragons hunched on broken stone ramparts, occasionally letting out eerie cries that echoed through the ruin. Daenerys spent an hour walking the perimeter with Barristan and Missandei, checking on the Unsullied's placements. Men bowed their heads respectfully, though fear still lingered in their eyes when they glanced at Regal perched overhead. When Daenerys returned to her tent, she found Robb inside, waiting for her, which gave her a start he had never entered unannounced before. He stood near the brazier, hands extended for warmth, gray wind at his side. Quickly, he dipped his head in apology. "Forgive me. I needed a private space to speak, and your handmaids said you would be back soon." Daenerys steadied her breath. "Of course. Is something amiss?" His face was drawn, the shadows from the brazier's flame accentuating the lines of worry under his eyes. "I've just had word from the Riverlands. One of my fast riders came in. The Lannisters are indeed on the move." Tywin marches from Harrenhal toward the Trident. He's got his banners arrayed as if expecting a major confrontation. He's also gained fresh support from the Freys. She frowned, taking a seat on a simple folding stool. "The Freys? The same house that demanded your marital arrangement?" A flicker of pain crossed Robb's face. "Yes. Walder Frey. His brood is large and he's cunning. I had hoped to reconcile with him, but it seems he's playing all sides. If the Lannisters have purchased his loyalty, the crossing at the Twins might be denied to us. Or worse, used against us." Daenerys leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "Then we must be ready. Where do your mother and uncle stand?" "They're in Riverrun, yes." Robb exhaled. "They're fortifying the castle, but if Tywin's heading north, it means the Riverlands will burn anew. We must bring our forces to bear soon. If we don't, Tywin could try to choke off our approach through the neck from the south, coordinating with Bolton or other malcontents. Or he might simply ravage the Riverlands, hoping to draw us into a rushed engagement." She weighed the possibilities, her mind cycling through what she knew of Tywin's reputation. He was the man who orchestrated the sack of King's Landing, known for ruthless strategy. "We march at dawn tomorrow, then. No point in waiting another day." Robb looked at her, clearly surprised. "Are your men ready for that pace?" She managed a small, grim smile. "The Unsullied can march. They're tireless. The dragons can hunt if supply lines grow thin. My mercenaries will grumble, but they'll follow. If it spares the Riverlands further destruction, we should move. I want to face Tywin on our terms, not his." A spark of gratitude and something like admiration flickered in Robb's eyes. "Very well. We move at dawn." A moment of silence settled between them. Then he murmured, "Thank you. You didn't have to commit so quickly." Daenerys stood, crossing to stand beside him at the brazier. The heat licked her face, easing some of the chill that clung to her clothing. "We are allies. I will not stand idle while your people suffer." He inclined his head. "Then we'll be gone by first light. We'll wade through the rest of the neck and push south at speed. We may have to split the army if the roads become too constricted, but let's do what we can to stay united." He paused, glancing at her. "I'll let you rest." He turned to go, but hesitated at the tent flap. Gray wind whined softly at his side. Robb's gaze lingered on Daenerys as though he wanted to say more. Finally, he only said, "Safe night, Daenerys," and stepped out into the gloom. She stood by the brazier for a time, the embers glow dancing on the tent's canvas. The weight of war settled heavily on her heart. Tywin Lannister was no fool. He would test every crack in their alliance. She felt a stirring of memories of her earliest days in Essos, caught in the net of her brother's ambition, forced to rely on uncertain allies. Yet this time she had an army of her own, dragons grown large and fierce. More than that, she had a partner in Robb Stark. The thought warmed her in a way that had little to do with the brazier's heat. She offered a silent prayer to gods old and new, then prepared for a short, uneasy night's sleep. Morning broke with a cold drizzle. The combined forces of Stark and Targaryen slogged south out of Moat Cailin, forging through the final leagues of the neck. Trees draped with moss leaned over the road, and pools of brackish water reflected iron-gray skies. Occasionally, a Crannogman scout would appear from the gloom, short of stature, clad in muddy green and brown, bow slung across his back, to confer with Robb or the Blackfish, then vanish again into the swamp. They reported that Lannister outriders had not yet pushed this far, meaning the king in the north and the Dragon Queen had a small margin of time to choose the battlefield. By midday, they emerged onto firmer ground. The land began to open into rolling fields dotted with stands of oak and elm. The damp chill still clung to everything, but it felt like a welcome relief after the oppressive bog. Daenerys let out a slow breath, grateful to see the horizon stretch before them. Drogon soared overhead, screeching at the wide sky as if triumphant at leaving the swamp behind. In the early afternoon, they paused near a small stream to water horses and gather news from riders who had gone on ahead. One such rider, an older man wearing the dire wolf sigil on his cloak, arrived splattered with mud and breathing hard. He reined up before Robb and Daenerys, bowing quickly. "Your graces," he gasped. "I bring word from the Blackfish. Tywin's main host is believed to be marching up the western bank of the Green Fork, heading for the crossroads. If he crosses near the Twins, he can move east to cut off our path." Robb's jaw set. "Then we need to quicken our pace. If Tywin gets north of us, we'll be trapped between him and the Freys." The rider nodded. "Lord Brynden says he'll try to shadow Tywin's movements from the south, but his forces are outnumbered. He's urging you to make haste." Daenerys considered the map. "The Twins are near the border between the Riverlands and the north, correct? That crossing is vital. We cannot let Tywin fortify it." Robb nodded grimly. "We'll push on. If we can get south of the Twins before Tywin arrives, we can choose a battlefield more to our advantage. Perhaps near the Trident's fords." They lost little time. Rain fell intermittently, turning roads to sludge, but the combined force pressed onward. Daenerys rode at the head of her Unsullied, encouraging them to keep stride, while the Northmen trudged or rode with grim determination. Dawn after dawn, they rose and drove themselves south, forging across countryside battered by war. They passed burned farms and weeping villagers, half-abandoned hamlets where starving children stared from doorways. Daenerys ordered her men to buy provisions rather than take them, but there was precious little to purchase. She shared what stores she could spare, remembering the lessons of Meereen. Hearts and minds were won not just by might, but by compassion. At night, the armies camped in fields that were churned into mud by hooves and boots. Dragons roost on ridge lines or old watchtowers. Sometimes Daenerys would hear shrill screams in the dark as scavengers and bandits tested the perimeter, only to be driven off by watchful sentries. Now and again she spied the glint of pale eyes in a distant campfire's glow, Bolton's men keeping to themselves. She did not trust them, nor did Robb entirely, but they remained outwardly loyal. 2 weeks of punishing march brought them near the crossroads region. Storms raked the land with frigid rain, turning the wide fields into a muddy morass. Reports came in daily. Tywin Lannister advanced steadily, burning villages rumored to harbor Stark sympathizers. The Freys massed at the Twins, uncertain yet which side to favor, though rumors suggested Walder Frey demanded rich bribes from both the Lannisters and the Starks. Daenerys's face hardened each time she heard of these petty games costing innocent lives. She pressed on, urging her men forward. The dragons were restless, frequently taking to the skies to scout or to hunt. Whenever they returned, they reeked of charred venison or goat. Finally, they reached a broad plain north of the Red Fork, the day overcast and cool. Sparse trees dotted the landscape and the ground sloped gently toward the river. Smoke smudged the sky to the south, marking the presence of Tywin's camp. Daenerys, Robb, and their leading captains reined up on a rise to survey the terrain. Cloaked scouts pointed out the approximate Lannister positions beyond a stand of poplar trees and a low ridge, perhaps a league away. Robb's face was grim. "Tywin is close enough that we might engage him tomorrow. Or the next day if we move quickly. We have superior positioning, I believe. The ground here is open, favorable for dragons." Daenerys scanned the plains, her heart pounding. This was it, the place they might finally meet Tywin's army in open battle. It would be the first time her dragons fought an army of Westeros, the first time the Unsullied locked spears with the Lannister foot. The ground felt charged with the promise of blood and fire. She turned to Robb. "Let us make our stand here, then. If we seize the initiative, we can choose our ground. Tywin will have no choice but to meet us or retreat." Robb nodded. He signaled the Grey John, who let out a bellowing roar of command. Drums began to roll across the ranks. Men moved to form lines along the ridge, bearing the dire wolf and the three-headed dragon flags. The Unsullied assembled with machine-like precision, forming neat blocks of spears. The Northmen and Bolton's men took positions on the flanks, while the Second Sons formed a cavalry detachment under Dario's flamboyant leadership. Tents rose quickly behind the lines, a forward camp. Daenerys could smell the tension in the air, sensed the hearts beating fast. That evening, Robb and Daenerys conferred in a large command tent pitched on the slope overlooking the plain. Torches flared in the gloom, sputtering with the damp. Gathered around the map-laden table were the Blackfish, the Great John, Lady Mormont, Roose Bolton, Dario, Cerberustan, and a handful of others. Rain spattered the canvas overhead. The acrid scent of wet wool and sweaty bodies filled the enclosure. Robb tapped a section of the map. "We'll position the Unsullied in the center. They're disciplined enough to hold against any Lannister charge. The Northmen will secure the flanks. My cavalry will be on the left wing, ready to sweep around. Dario's riders on the right, the Second Sons. The dragons," he paused and turned to Daenerys. "You know best how to deploy them, though I recommend using them to terrorize and break the Lannister lines once they're engaged. Avoid leaving them perched on the ground as targets for archers or scorpions." Daenerys nodded. "Agreed. They'll circle above until I decide to strike. I'll keep Drogon with me for greater control." She glanced at Dario. "Your men must be prepared for the chaos dragons cause on the battlefield: smoke, flame, terrified horses. Keep discipline." Dario grinned wolfishly. "My men thrive on chaos, my queen. Just point us at the lions and we'll carve them up for you." Bolton's pale voice slid into the conversation. "And if Tywin does not engage us but pulls back to the twins, forcing us to either siege the crossing or retreat, we risk being pinned against the river." Robb's stare was ice. "Tywin might well try. But we have the advantage: dragons and a unified front. He'll think twice before allowing us time to choose the perfect moment to strike. Also, we have outriders watching every approach. If the Lannisters attempt to reposition, we'll know." Bolton's lips curved slightly. "Very well. We stand ready." The War Council concluded and the men dispersed. Outside, night clung to the sky, broken only by the guttering flames of camp torches. The distant rumble of thunder hinted at more rain. Daenerys felt a coil of nervous energy in her stomach, the anticipatory burn she recognized from previous battles. She found Robb standing outside the tent, gazing across the dark plain. A line of flickering lights far in the distance hinted at Lannister campfires. She stepped up beside him, drawing her cloak closer about her shoulders. For a time, neither spoke, simply listening to the hush of wind in the grass. The presence of the enemy felt like a living thing beyond the darkness, thousands of soldiers breathing, eating, sharpening swords. She imagined Tywin Lannister in a grand pavilion, calmly planning his own maneuvers. At length, Robb exhaled slowly. "Tomorrow might be the day we break the Lannisters' power." Daenerys nodded. "Or tomorrow might be the day we lose everything. War is never certain." He glanced her way. The torchlight revealed the tension in his jaw. "I've fought battles before, but never one with dragons overhead. That might change everything, or we might lose men in the confusion. I wish we had more time to prepare, to coordinate with the River Lords, but time is a luxury we don't have." Daenerys was quiet a moment. "I was not raised to lead armies, you know," she said softly. "I was sold to a Dothraki call. My brother expected I'd be only a bridge to power. It took me time to learn how to lead. But one thing I learned is that caution can only take us so far. Eventually, we must risk everything for the future we want." Robb nodded. Wise words. Then he turned fully to her, and for a moment, in the hush of the night, she glimpsed the weight he carried. "For what it's worth, Daenerys, I'm grateful to you. If you hadn't come, I don't know that the North could have stood much longer, not after all the betrayals and losses. Win or lose tomorrow, we stand a chance because you brought dragons to our cause." She searched his face, seeing the earnestness, the flicker of gratitude, perhaps something more. "We stand a chance because you never stopped fighting for your people. And because your father's memory lit a spark in you. And now, maybe tomorrow, that spark will ignite a blaze the Lannisters can't extinguish." He looked momentarily taken aback, then dipped his head in acknowledgement. "Then let's ensure that blaze is a just one." He paused as if considering his next words. "Where will you command from tomorrow?" She drew a breath. "I'll be in the sky on Drogon. It's where I can best direct the dragons and see the field. Cerberustan and Missandei will remain with the Unsullied command." Robb tried to mask a flicker of unease. "Be careful. Archers, siege weapons. Tywin might be cunning." She allowed herself a small smile, placing a hand briefly on his forearm. "I've survived many cunning foes, Robb Stark. I intend to survive Tywin as well." He nodded, covering her hand with his gloved fingers for a heartbeat, a fleeting intimacy in the dark. Then he stepped back, voice turning brisk. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be bloody." Without another word, he strode away, gray wind emerging from the shadows to pad after him. Daenerys stood alone, the night pressing close. A damp wind tugged at her hair. She found her thoughts drifting to the day ahead, to the image of dragons diving upon Lannister lines, to the clangor of steel and the screams of men. She remembered Astapor when her dragons were still small. She had used cunning and fire to topple a tyrant. But Tywin Lannister was no slaver with delusions of grandeur. He was a tactician who had outmaneuvered countless foes. Yet she reminded herself that she was no longer that frightened girl in the red waste. She was Daenerys Targaryen, mother of dragons, ally to the king in the north. She would do whatever it took to see justice done and to see the realm freed from lion's claws. With that thought burning in her mind, she returned to her tent. The night would be long, but dawn would come soon enough. Dawn broke in streaks of pink and orange, the sky clearing after the rains. A fine mist clung to the ground, swirling around the legs of men and horses. Across the plain, war horns began to blare, a low and mournful sound that quickened the pulse of every soul in both camps. The Lannisters were forming their ranks in the distance, a sea of red and gold. Tywin's banners flapped in the breeze, a golden lion on crimson. The Frey sigils intermingled among them in smaller numbers. Daenerys watched from a small rise where she stood beside Drogon, the largest of her dragons, who prowled restlessly. Below her, the Unsullied assembled in perfect ranks, their spears and shields catching the early light. The northern hosts and Bolton's men formed the flanks, with banners of the dire wolf and the flayed man snapping. Robb was at the head of the northern cavalry. Daario and the second sons ranged on the opposite flank, flamboyant in their armor, ready to ride down any who fled. Daenerys could see Tywin's host shifting in the distance. Even from here, she noticed the crisp discipline of the Lannister lines. They outnumbered her alliance, though not as heavily as they might have months ago. The presence of dragons offset that advantage. She felt her heart hammering against her ribs. A horn blast from the northern lines signaled readiness. Daenerys gave Drogon a light touch, speaking a word in High Valyrian. He growled and extended his wings. She climbed onto his back with practiced ease, hooking her legs around the improvised saddle. A hush seemed to fall across her immediate surroundings. Then, with a thunderous beat of his wings, Drogon leapt into the sky. The world dropped away beneath her as they ascended, the rush of air tearing at her hair, her cloak flapping behind. She spied Rhaegal and Viserion rising from different points in the rear, guided by the scent of the oncoming battle. Below, thousands of men stirred in anxious wonder as the dragons took flight. It was a sight not witnessed in Westeros for over a century, dragons soaring above a battlefield about to unleash fire and fury. Daenerys guided Drogon toward the front lines. Through the swirling morning mist, she glimpsed Tywin's army. The Lannister front bristled with spearmen and crossbowmen, likely commanded by some seasoned knight or lesser lord. She scanned for siege engines. She spotted a few scorpions, large crossbow-like contraptions, being wheeled forward. The Lannisters had prepared for dragons. Steel clashed below. The Unsullied had begun an orderly advance, shields locked, spears angled forward. On the flanks, northern knights and horse archers readied themselves to charge. Daenerys circled overhead, watching for Tywin's move. It came swiftly, a volley of crossbow bolts aimed skyward, whistling dangerously close to Drogon. She leaned low over his neck, urging him higher. Drogon roared, banked, and avoided most of the volley, though a few bolts clattered off his scales. From the corner of her eye, Daenerys saw Rhaegal spew greenish fire onto a cluster of Lannister pikemen, scattering them in panic. Now the battle raged in earnest. The thunder of cavalry charges shook the earth, and the clash of steel on steel rang through the air. Men screamed and bellowed. Northern horsemen smashed into the Lannister flank, throwing many to the ground. Meanwhile, the Lannister center engaged the Unsullied in furious melee, crossbowmen firing overhead, spears thrusting at the disciplined ranks. The Unsullied responded with deadly efficiency, stepping forward in synchronized stabs, slamming shields to repel each charge. Daenerys angled Drogon into a dive, heat building in her chest. "Dracarys," she cried. Drogon unleashed a torrent of flame upon a scorpion emplacement. Wood and rope ignited in an instant, and the Lannister crew scattered, screaming as the inferno consumed them. Another volley of bolts soared up, some narrowly missing. One bolt struck Drogon's flank but failed to penetrate his thick scales. He let out a furious shriek and belched flame across another group of enemy crossbowmen. Below, she glimpsed Robb Stark cutting through ranks of Lannister infantry, his sword flashing. Grey Wind was in the fray, savaging men who tried to flank Robb's position. The northern cavalry pressed forward, driving deeper into Lannister lines. But Tywin's men did not break easily. Waves of halberdiers moved to counter the cavalry, and ranks of disciplined spearmen turned to face the second sons on the opposite flank. The field became a churn of mud, blood, and bodies. The clangor of war was deafening. Daenerys soared overhead, scanning for Tywin himself, though she doubted the Lord of Casterly Rock would be so foolish as to ride at the forefront. Likely he commanded from the rear. Another group of crossbowmen took aim at Drogon. She urged him into a steep climb, dodging the barrage. Rhaegal and Viserion swept in from the flanks, spitting flames that licked across the Lannister columns. Smoke billowed, blotting out parts of the battlefield. Suddenly, cries of alarm rose from the northern flank. Daenerys twisted in the saddle to see a large force of mounted knights, Lannister reserves, charging from a concealed position behind a low ridge. They crashed into the unsuspecting Northmen on the left, threatening to split the alliance's line. Daenerys spotted the Great John bellowing orders, trying to rally the men. But the surprise had thrown them into disarray. Drogon flapped his wings hard, bearing Daenerys over the swirling chaos. Her heart pounded. If the northern flank collapsed, the entire line could fold. She guided Drogon into another dive, ignoring the crossbow volleys that whirred by. When she was close enough, she shouted, "Dracarys!" again. Drogon bathed the Lannister knights in a cone of searing flame. Horses shrieked, knights toppled, armor glowing red-hot. The stench of charred flesh rose, sickening yet a grim necessity. The Great John led a countercharge, and the battered Lannister cavalry reeled. The battlefield devolved into pockets of savage fighting. The Unsullied held the center but advanced slowly, pressed by the weight of Lannister numbers. Bolton's men on the right flank cut down many foes but sustained heavy casualties themselves. Dario's second sons darted in and out, harrying Lannister outriders. Daenerys circled overhead, unleashing Drogon's flames on key clusters, mindful not to burn her own troops. Time lost meaning in the chaos. Dawn's first light gave way to the smoky haze of midday, the sun nearly obscured by the fumes of burning wagons and the dust kicked up by thousands of stamping feet. Daenerys felt her throat grow hoarse from shouting commands. Her muscles ached from clinging to Drogon's back, and she sensed the dragon's growing fatigue from repeated dives. Yet the tide of battle seemed to turn slowly in their favor. The Lannisters were formidable, but dragons sowed terror no shield wall could fully repel. Then came a moment of crisis. On the right flank, Daenerys saw the line buckle as the Lannisters mounted a fierce push. Figures in lavish armor led the charge, perhaps a commander of note. Bolton's men struggled to hold. Some began to fall back, and Daenerys felt a spike of alarm. She wheeled Drogon that way, noticing a swirl of pink and red banners amidst the confusion. Something about it felt off. Bolton's men were retreating more than they should. She urged Drogon lower. Suddenly, from above, Rhaegal let out a savage roar. Daenerys looked up in time to see a hail of massive bolts streaking through the sky. Someone had positioned scorpions behind the Lannister line, targeting the dragons. Rhaegal took a bolt to the shoulder, screaming in fury as a second bolt tore through the membrane of his wing. He lashed out with green flame, incinerating the scorpion crew, but his wing faltered, and he spiraled downward, crashing beyond Daenerys' view. Viserion shrieked and wheeled around, spitting golden flames upon another scorpion battery. Daenerys' heart lurched. Fear for Rhaegal flared in her chest. She inhaled sharply, fighting the urge to break away from the main fight to find him. Drogon roared, and she steered him downward toward the threatened flank, hoping to break the Lannister push quickly so she could search for her wounded dragon. But as she descended, she saw banners in disarray. Flayed man sigils clashed with direwolf sigils, some men turning on each other in the middle of the chaos. A sense of horror slammed into her. Bolton's men were attacking the northern host. There, in the melee, she glimpsed the pale figure of Roose Bolton calmly directing archers to fire into the backs of Northmen who had been fighting the Lannisters. A savage betrayal in the heart of the battle. "Seven hells?" Daenerys hissed, leaning close to Drogon. "Dracarys!" The dragon unleashed flame onto a cluster of Bolton archers, sending them screaming. But the damage was done. The right flank reeled under the sudden treachery. Lannister knights rushed in to exploit the confusion. Bodies littered the ground, Stark men dying not just at the hands of lions but from the knives of their supposed allies. Daenerys knew she had to alert Robb. She scanned the fray for a sign of the king in the north. Across the field, she saw him, banner streaming behind, locked in combat with a group of Lannister swordsmen. Grey wind lunged and tore into a man's throat. Robb cut down another. He was pushing deeper, trying to break the center. He might not yet know of Bolton's treachery. Daenerys spurred Drogon toward him, weaving through smoke and arrows, scorching any Lannister pockets that threatened to strike. She swooped low, calling out, her voice lost in the din. At last, Robb looked up, shield raised, face smeared with dirt and blood. She pointed urgently to the right flank, shouting, "Bolton, betrayal!" She saw shock etch itself across his features, followed by raw fury. He bashed aside a Lannister footman, bellowing for his nearest bannermen to follow him. Then he signaled a retreat, or at least a regroup, from the center, dispatching riders to spread the word. But in the thick press of bodies and swirling smoke, retreat was a chaotic endeavor. Men heard contradictory orders. Some continued to fight, others broke ranks. The Unsullied remained disciplined, but they were pinned by Lannister press. Dario's cavalry harassed pockets of lions, but they couldn't hold the entire flank alone. Meanwhile, Bolton's men carved a bloody path through scattered Stark forces. Daenerys watched in horror as pockets of the Alliance collapsed under this twin assault. She forced Drogon into a final, punishing dive over the Bolton traitors. Fire gushed from Drogon's jaws, incinerating dozens of them, but others scattered, and the fierce wind of the dive nearly unseated her. Arrows hissed past, one grazing her thigh. Pain flared, but she kept her grip. Everywhere she looked, the battlefield was drowning in blood and flames. Somehow, Robb rallied a contingent of Northmen near the center. The Greyjohn joined him, battered but alive. The Unsullied realigned, their commander barked orders in Valyrian, and they began a fighting withdrawal toward a ridge. Daenerys circled overhead, flames lashing out to keep the Lannisters at bay. Little by little, the Alliance's battered remnants pulled back from the worst of the killing field. At last, the swirl of battle subsided. The Lannisters did not press the pursuit too far, perhaps fearing the dragons or suffering heavy losses themselves. Bolton's men seemed content to hold the ground they had seized, linking up with Lannister ranks. The plain was a charnel house of smoldering wagons, corpses, wounded men crying for help. Daenerys guided Drogon to a rocky outcrop where she dared land. Her body trembled with exhaustion, her legs stung where the arrow had glanced. She slid from Drogon's flank, boots hitting the ground amid scattered stones. The dragon panted, sides heaving. Moments later, Robb galloped up, gray wind still at his side. His face was ashen, drenched in blood not all his own. Behind him rode the great Jon, Lady Mormont, and a few ragged survivors. Daenerys's Unsullied formed a ring around the outcrop. Many bore wounds, but they stood stoically, shields raised. Daario joined them, sporting a bloody bandage around his forearm. Robb dismounted, glaring at the far side of the battlefield. Bolton's banners flew alongside Lannister lions, a horrifying sight. "He betrayed us," Robb's voice was choked with fury. In the heat of battle, Daenerys's voice was tight with loathing. It seems he'd arranged this with Tywin all along, or waited for the perfect moment. The great Jon spat onto the ground. "Bloody flaying bastard. I'll tear his heart out." A swirl of grief and rage twisted Daenerys' stomach. The alliance was broken by internal treachery. So many men lay dead. She looked to the sky for Rhaegal or Viserion. She saw only Viserion circling above the Lannister lines, venting an occasional burst of flame. Rhaegal was nowhere in sight. Her heart clenched. "I must find Rhaegal," she said, voice wavering. "He was struck by bolts." Robb set a hand gently on her shoulder. "We'll search. First, we need to rally whoever's left and withdraw to a defensible position. Tywin might press the advantage if we linger." She swallowed back panic. "Right? Yes. We gather the survivors." She glanced over the battered remnants of the field, where hundreds still scrambled. "And as for Bolton?" Robb's eyes burned with furious resolve. "He'll pay for this. By the old gods, he will pay. But we must live to see that reckoning." He mounted his horse again, calling for messengers to ride out and gather any stragglers. Daario barked orders for the Second Sons. The Unsullied formed a perimeter, ready to repel any Lannister probes. Daenerys climbed back onto Drogon, urging him skyward despite his labored breathing. She needed to find Rhaegal before the Lannisters or Bolton's men found him first. As Drogon took flight, Daenerys gazed down upon the field, a vision of carnage. Smoke drifted in tattered columns. She saw the glimmer of broken steel half sunk into bloody mud. Horses, men, all fallen. Some still crawled or moaned. She forced herself to push past the horror, scanning the edges where Regal might have gone down. At last, she spotted a swath of charred trees beyond the main site of battle. Something large had crashed there. She guided Drogon lower. Through the haze, she glimpsed Regal thrashing on the ground, the scorpion bolt still embedded in his shoulder, his wing battered. A handful of Lannister soldiers approached, spears leveled, presumably seeking to kill or capture a wounded dragon. Daenerys' anger flared white-hot. She commanded Drogon to unleash fire, and in moments the soldiers were cinders. Regal roared in pain and tried to snap at Daenerys as she and Drogon landed nearby. She could see the panic in his eyes. He recognized her, but the agony drove him wild. Carefully, she slid from Drogon's side and approached Regal. He bared fangs, smoky breath hissing between them. The ground trembled with each movement of his colossal body. "Easy," she murmured, voice shaking. She repeated soothing words in Valyrian, stepping closer. His scales were slick with dark blood. She could feel his pain like an echo in her own body, and tears pricked her eyes. With trembling hands, she reached for the scorpion bolt. It was lodged deep, though not in his heart. Another inch might have pierced his vital organs. If it remained, infection or further injury could prove fatal. Drogon crouched protectively, eyes narrowed as if uncertain how to help. Regal let out a ragged, pained moan. Daenerys grit her teeth and grabbed the bolt's shaft. Regal jerked, nearly knocking her aside. "Shoo!" she pleaded. With a sudden yank, she tore the bolt free. Dark blood spurted, and Regal convulsed, roaring in agony. But the worst of the bolt was out. Daenerys pressed a cloth from her belt against the wound, mindful that this was a crude measure. She had no real dragon healer, but perhaps, with time, Regal's natural resilience would let him heal. A fresh shout reached her ears. More Lannister troops, or Bolton's men, were approaching from the field. She spun to see a band of a dozen or so, brandishing swords and spears, drawn by the sound of the dragon's roars. Drogon hissed, preparing to defend his wounded brother. Daenerys realized they were badly outnumbered and in a precarious position. If these foes had scorpion bolts or archers, she and her dragons might be doomed. Then, abruptly, figures in northern cloaks crashed into the flank of the approaching soldiers. Robb Stark, Grey Wind, and a handful of mounted knights. Robb's sword flashed. Grey Wind tore a man's throat open. Within moments, the Lannisters lay dead. Robb slid from his horse, panting, face taut with urgency. "Daenerys, are you hurt?" She shook her head, letting go of Regal's wound to show him. "He's badly wounded, but alive." Robb grimaced as he surveyed the wounded dragon. "We need to get both of you out of here before more men come." He waved at his knights. "Clear a path. We retreat north." Daenerys pressed the cloth to Regal's wound again. He hissed, blood frothing at his nostrils. In a pained motion, he tried to rise. His left wing was torn, but his legs still seemed functional. "Come on," Daenerys urged softly. "You can do it. Just a little further." She guided him step by step, while Drogon guarded against any threat that dared approach. Robb helped keep watch, sword drawn, Grey Wind snarling at the edges of the clearing. Step by step, Regal limped forward, a trail of blood spattering the grass. At last, they reached a more secure area where a small cluster of Unsullied had formed a defensive ring. Beyond it, Daenerys saw the battered remains of the allied host streaming north. The Lannisters had not launched a full pursuit, likely too bloodied themselves, but sporadic skirmishes continued. Robb's men guarded the perimeter, helping the wounded limp away. Dario's cavalry formed a rearguard, exchanging occasional arrow fire with Lannister outriders. Quickly, Daenerys and Robb coordinated a hasty withdrawal. The alliance was in disarray, the betrayal by Bolton having shattered morale. Word spread like wildfire. The Boltons had joined the Lannisters. Many men cursed, spat, or wept as they retreated, furious at such treachery. The Great John tried to rouse them with roars of vengeance, but the best they could do now was survive and regroup. Within an hour, the field was mostly abandoned to Tywin's battered but victorious forces and Bolton's traitors. Daenerys, riding Drogon in a halting, protective flight, guided Regal from the air as he hobbled along. Viserion joined them, scorched and exhausted but not gravely wounded. Thousands of her men, unsullied, Northmen mercenaries, had lived, but thousands more lay dead or dying behind them. The union of wolf and dragon had been tested, and treachery had left them reeling. Night fell as they reached a patch of woodland where scouts had found a defensible position by a shallow river. Fires sprang up, illuminating fearful, haggard faces. The moans of the injured mingled with the hush of wind through the trees. Daenerys oversaw the triage of her wounded dragons, wincing as she realized how grave Regal's injuries were. Unsullied medics used boiled wine to clean the wound, pressing bandages as best they could. Regal rumbled in misery but seemed stable for the moment. Robb arrived at her makeshift camp, walking slowly, his armor dented, blood smeared across his surcoat. The exhaustion in his eyes mirrored her own. Neither spoke for a moment, each carrying the weight of defeat. Finally, he said hoarsely, "We lost so many. The Lannisters and Bolton." He passed a trembling hand across his face. "I never suspected he would strike in the middle of the fight like that." Daenerys looked at the ground. Treacherous men always choose the moment that hurts the most. "I'm sorry." He shook his head. "My father had faith in men's honor. I tried to be like him, but maybe I should have listened to the warnings about Bolton." She touched his arm lightly, mindful that her own hands still shook with adrenaline. "We can't change what's done. Now we must decide our next move. Tywin is bruised, but he holds the field. Bolton has declared himself a Lannister ally. The Freys might do the same. And we," she glanced at Regal's injured form. "We are weaker." His jaw set, but not broken. "We still have men left. You still have dragons, 2 healthy, 1 wounded. That's more than Tywin can claim, though he is cunning. We retreat north for now, gather our strength. Then we strike back." She sighed. "Yes. We cannot face them again so soon." She saw tears glistening in his eyes, though he did not let them fall. Grief for the men who had bled and died under his banner. For the father he had lost, for the kingdom that seemed to slip further from his grasp. With quiet resolve, she stepped closer. He looked at her, the flickering firelight catching the lines of anguish on his face. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a shared lament for the horrors unleashed, a defiance that still burned bright. He swallowed hard. "We'll not let the Lannisters and Bolton have the final say. We will survive this. And we will have our vengeance." She nodded, a solemn vow forming in her chest. "Fire and blood, wolf and dragon. We will rise again." So in the darkness of that woodland camp, with the embers of hope and rage smoldering in equal measure, Daenerys Targaryen and Robb Stark steeled themselves for the next chapter of their war. The dream of Ned Stark's honor and Robert's unity had taken a harsh blow, but it was not extinguished. Beyond the trees, the night stretched deep and cold. Tomorrow beckoned with uncertainty, a horizon fraught with enemies and betrayal. Yet beneath that dark sky, a wounded dragon still breathed, a young king still gripped his sword, and a queen refused to yield. Their alliance had been tested by fire, and though battered, it endured, bound now by the shared promise that the war was far from over and the realm's future remained theirs to claim.